They first met in a quiet corner of a desert city, where the scorching heat of the sun seemed both merciless and oddly comforting. The air vibrated in that southern sky, turning the distance into a watery mirage, and the smell of dust mingled with a faint promise of rain. Three young men with hopes, regrets, and hidden convictions walked through a neighborhood that flickered in and out of memory like a dream. They were bound by some intangible thread of fate, unaware that their differences would lead them down a winding path reminiscent of ancient parables. Their names were Adam, Mark, and Zane. On the surface, they were only loosely connected, co-workers at a local non-profit that assisted recent immigrants, among them many who had fled war-torn countries, carrying little more than old family photographs and battered Qurans in their suitcases. Each morning, the three arrived at the office, greeting each other with the routine half-smiles of professional civility. Yet beneath this veneer, a deeper bond was germinating. Perhaps it was the enormous responsibility they felt for the people they served, perhaps it was the intangible sense of accountability that settled over them when they realized how powerfully all their life decisions were shaped by faith, or the lack thereof. Adam was a convert to Islam, having come to it in his early 20s after a tumultuous period searching for meaning. He saw in the Quran, particularly in Surah 18, a luminous guiding force, a tapestry of stories that whispered universal truths. It spoke of the fleeting nature of worldly power, of the illusions that wealth and pride conjure, and of the deeper wisdom one can only acquire through humility. Adam had been raised in a nominally Christian household but admitted he had only discovered the profundity of the sacred once he chose Islam of his own accord. Now, with every move he made, every breath he exhaled, he carried an undercurrent of awe for the subtle lines of the scripture he had embraced. Mark was different, perhaps the least religiously inclined of the trio. He called himself spiritual but not religious, dipping into various traditions like a casual traveler sampling local dishes. When he was younger, he had studied Buddhism for a few years, then embraced a modern, self-styled practice of meditation and mindfulness. He read widely, the teachings of Rumi, the Christian monastics, secular philosophy, even bits of the Quran that Adam would occasionally share with him. Yet Mark remained uncommitted, always stepping one foot forward and quickly drawing the other back. Deep down, there was an unspoken fear that any structured belief might demand more from him than he was ready to give. Zane was a devout Muslim from birth. Unlike Adam, who had journeyed into Islam as an outsider, Zane had been raised in a household that prayed 5 times a day, memorized surahs in Arabic, and filled the living room shelves with volumes of Islamic commentary. The constant presence of faith shaped his every decision, instilling a sense of discipline and certainty. Yet in the last few months, a quiet restlessness had been stirring in him. He felt weighed down by the visible hypocrisy of people who claimed piety while trampling on the rights and dignity of others. He had begun to question how best to reconcile the faith he loved with the moral complexities of the real world, a struggle that pressed at the edges of his heart. One late afternoon, a mysterious encounter at the local library set the stage for their deeper bond. The library was located in a modern building that contrasted sharply with the aged, sun-bleached stucco of the older parts of the city. Inside, the air conditioning was unrelenting, almost frigid compared to the scorching heat outside. The three friends had gathered there to meet a refugee family from Yemen that needed help completing essential paperwork. After the meeting, Adam led them into a quiet reading room, wanting to discuss a verse from the Quran that the father of the family had mentioned, referencing Surah 18, "The book will be placed, and you will see the sinners fearful of that which is recorded therein." Mark listened intently, the words resonating in him in a way that reminded him of the great cosmic judgments he had read about in other traditions. Zane nodded in understanding, but there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes, as if the verse conjured memories that both comforted and haunted him. Adam told them that this verse often reminded him of accountability, that even the smallest deeds we do echo beyond our comprehension. The Quran vividly portrays an ultimate day of judgment, the unveiling of a book of deeds, a life's ledger that spares no detail. They were seated in an unassuming corner, an old wooden table between them. Golden sunlight filtered through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. In hushed tones, Adam explained that this moment in Surah 18 precedes the story of Moses, who sets out on a journey to seek knowledge at the junction of two C's, Moses' sincerity, humility, and readiness to learn from someone mysterious. Adam linked it to the idea of the three friends: we each come from different vantage points, different worlds. Maybe we're on a parallel journey, in search of truths we can't yet articulate. Differences might be blessings. Mark gave a half-smile, more cautious than skeptical. You say this might be a sign for us, maybe it is. But I've always found signs easy to miss. Life has a way of drowning out subtle hints. Zane stroked his chin thoughtfully, mindful not to dismiss Mark's hesitation. Surah 18 also speaks of people who might question or doubt. Moses himself questioned repeatedly, learning at each step. There's no shame in doubt if it leads to deeper understanding. The three men parted that day under a sky ignited by a desert sunset. It was the kind of evening sky that transforms into a grand spectacle of crimson, gold, and violet. Adam made his way home feeling renewed. Mark, by contrast, drove to a local cafe, a swirl of questions in his mind. Zane returned to his apartment, comforted by the day's sense of unity yet troubled by the feeling that his own convictions were shifting in subtle, unpredictable ways. That night, a warm wind gusted through the city. Curtains fluttered in open windows. Stray cats threaded through alleys. Somewhere, an old man read the Quran by lamplight, his hushed voice accompanying the melodic cadence of the Arabic. And in the hearts of the three friends, something stirred like an ancient calling. The stage was set for them to learn not only about each other but about the nature of faith, humility, and the illusions that can plague the human heart. Weeks passed, filled with ordinary tasks and fleeting conversations that revealed the depth of the bond forming between them. They would talk about the families they served at the nonprofit. Zane sometimes shared details of new arrivals from across the globe, fleeing violence, famine, tyranny, and how their presence underscored that the world was both vast and painfully small. Mark worried about the mental health of the displaced, especially the children, who sometimes cried in their sleep, haunted by memories no child should have to carry. Adam found solace in volunteering at a local mosque, inviting both friends to break bread at community dinners. One early morning, the three found themselves riding in Zane's car, heading to the outskirts of the city. A rumor had spread of a small community of newly arrived refugees in desperate need of assistance. The sun was still inching over the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the asphalt, and the cool desert air was unexpectedly sharp against their faces whenever they rolled down the windows. They spoke of many things on that drive. Mark mentioned a strange dream he'd had the night before, one in which he stood on the edge of a vast ocean, a place where two seas met, resembling the story in Surah 18. He saw three tall figures in the distance, friends or strangers, he couldn't tell, only that they beckoned him to follow. In the dream, he remembered feeling torn, as though each step toward them carried an unknown cost. The dream ended abruptly, leaving him filled with disquiet. Adam, glancing in the rearview mirror, asked if that dream could be a reflection of Mark's unease with spiritual commitment. Mark shrugged, uncertain. Zane, in the passenger seat, recalled that Surah 18, around verse 60, described Moses telling his companion, "I will not cease traveling until I reach the junction of the two seas, or I spend upon this journey ages." It was about unwavering determination to find the truth, to learn from someone guided by divine knowledge. Zane wondered whether the three of them might be replaying that narrative in their own modern tapestry. Each question, each dream, each restlessness was pushing them to journey beyond the everyday. But none could guess what hardships or revelations might emerge on the path ahead. The further they drove from the city, the more the landscape opened, revealing the rugged splendor of the desert. Jagged mountains rose in the distance, their colors shifting from ochre to reddish-brown. Sagebrush dotted the flats, and occasionally a roadrunner darted across the highway. The conversation took a more personal turn. Adam confessed that his father, despite respecting his decision to convert, never fully understood why his son would abandon the traditions of their forefathers. This had created a wedge in the family. Mark admitted his own parents weren't particularly devout in any faith, so they were mostly indifferent to his spiritual explorations. Zayn tried to reassure both men, emphasizing that the Quran speaks of each soul being guided by unique pathways, that no single life path is quite the same. When they finally arrived at the dusty settlement, they found makeshift tents pitched in a flat, sun-baked clearing. The people there recognized Zayn from previous visits. Women offered small cups of tea, grateful for a group of volunteers. Children wove between them, some shy, some curious. Adam asked gently after the men who seemed withdrawn, shell-shocked. Mark quickly noticed there were no medical personnel around. He made a mental note to find a clinic that might do outreach. Somewhere in the midst of that swirl of human suffering, the trio found their personal differences melting away. It no longer mattered how strongly Mark clung to his sense of skepticism or how keenly Adam and Zayn held to their convictions. What mattered was their shared recognition of human fragility, their mutual yearning to bring comfort to those who had lost everything. They stayed all day, distributing supplies, listening to harrowing accounts of perilous sea journeys and desert treks, hearing the elderly speak of the war that had upended their entire existence. Late in the afternoon, a sandstorm began forming in the distance, that faint orange haze swirling across the sky. The volunteers hurriedly helped the families secure their tents and belongings. The wind picked up, howling across the open terrain. The swirling dust reduced visibility to mere feet, making it impossible to remain outside. The three men found shelter in a small, half-built structure made of cinder blocks and steel beams. Inside that improvised fortress, the desert wind hammering at the walls, they huddled together. A single lantern cast wavering shadows on the concrete floor. The storm lasted well into the evening, and in that dim, tumultuous environment, they found themselves reflecting on the ephemeral nature of life and the illusions that can be swept away in an instant. Every swirl of dust outside echoed the verses of the Quran that spoke of the transience of worldly possessions, how success or status could dissolve like sand before the wind if not grounded in gratitude and humility. Adam recounted the lines he had read earlier that week, how Surah 18 holds lessons about wealth, pride, and gratitude. Though the more famous parable might begin earlier in the surah, the overarching message continued: the superficial things we often cling to would be laid bare in the final book, where all deeds are written. He said, in verse 49, it says, "And the book of deeds will be placed, and you will see the criminals fearful of that within it." That image is terrifying but also liberating. Nothing can hide from divine knowledge. We can't pretend, can't fake it. Our differences, our illusions, they're all clear. Mark, who rarely quoted scripture of any kind, found himself murmuring, it's almost as though the day of accountability is a universal concept. No matter the faith, there's a moment where everything is laid out. The question is whether we can live with integrity now, knowing that day is inevitable. Zayn, deeply moved, added, it's one thing to read these verses in a comfortable house. It's another to see how quickly a sandstorm can wipe away everything you think you own. Maybe that's the point. Life feels so solid, so permanent, but it's not. They lingered in silence, the wind's roar gradually diminishing. When at last the storm settled and the darkness outside turned into a vast, star-speckled sky, the three men stepped out of the shelter. A profound hush enveloped the land. Every now and then, a quiet cry of a child or whisper of an adult broke the stillness. The families came out of their tents, miraculously unharmed, and soon the work of clearing sand from doorways and supplies began. Close to midnight, the trio set up sleeping bags in the small cinderblock structure, using the dusty floor as a makeshift bed. Despite the physical discomfort, each felt an inexplicable sense of peace. As Adam drifted off, he thought of how Moses set out searching for a teacher who could show him deeper truths. Perhaps that teacher was not just a single individual, but all experiences guided by the will of the Almighty. Mark gazed up through the open roof, noticing stars shining like scattered pearls, recalling his dream of the two seas and the mysterious call. Zayn's mind roamed through the verses of Surah 18, the interplay of knowledge, humility, and unwavering devotion. They slept close together, as if forming a single tapestry of different threads. The next morning came swiftly. Dawn's light spread across the horizon, painting the sky with soft rose and pale orange. They rose to the sound of distant calls, women preparing breakfast, children laughing, men murmuring in relief that the worst of the storm had passed. The dryness of the desert clung to their throats, and they sipped water slowly to rehydrate. Over a modest meal of bread and tea, they reflected again on the ephemeral nature of everything around them and the deeper undercurrent of accountability that seemed etched into the landscape. Zayn offered to lead a brief prayer for anyone who wished to join. A few refugees joined him, forming a small circle on the packed sand. Adam also stood, his heart swelling with gratitude. Mark lingered at the periphery, quietly respectful, reflecting on the beauty of communal devotion. He felt oddly drawn toward this unity, even though part of him still resisted the idea of fully subscribing to a belief system. That tension between longing and hesitation had been his companion for years, and it had only grown more acute since these friendships began. Before leaving, the three spent hours meticulously ensuring the settlement had the supplies and phone numbers to reach proper aid organizations. They promised to return soon with more resources. Piling back into Zayn's car, they navigated the dusty road toward the main highway. The experience had left them both exhausted and enriched, as if each of their hearts bore the imprint of lessons beyond words. No one spoke for the first half hour of the drive. They simply stared at the wavering horizon, the desert sun once again asserting its dominion. Eventually, Mark broke the silence. "You know, I've been thinking about this book of deeds, how everything we do is recorded. When I first heard that concept, it felt frightening, like a cosmic surveillance system. But maybe it's also a reminder that our lives matter, that our actions ripple out into something larger, that we're never really just lost in the void." Adam nodded, one hand on the steering wheel, the other occasionally adjusting the air conditioner. "Yes, it's accountability, but also meaning. We matter. The Quran reminds us that none of our deeds, good or bad, go unnoticed. That can be a call to excellence, to sincerity." Zayn added softly, "I've grown up knowing that. Yet, I admit, I sometimes forget. It's easy to get wrapped up in routine. But after seeing these families, how they cling to faith in dire circumstances, it's like a wake-up call. Our differences might challenge us, but there's a deeper unity." The day stretched on as they returned to their city, each man lost in his own reverie. They parted with subdued goodbyes, promising to reconnect soon. In the privacy of their respective homes, each reflected on the swirl of experiences from that harrowing desert storm to the quiet hum of hope in the settlement. For Adam, the day reaffirmed his conviction that Islam was not merely about dogma, but about compassion in action. For Zayn, it was a moment of recentering, a reminder to find true sincerity in worship, unencumbered by the hypocrisy of the world. For Mark, it was a mystery that tugged at his heart, making him question whether he was ready to commit to any path of faith, or if, like Moses, he should set out on some spiritual pilgrimage, open to divine guidance. In the days that followed, each man faced personal struggles. Adam found himself confronting a colleague who mocked his Arabic recitations, suggesting religion was outdated. Mark wrestled with insomnia, his dreams filled with flickering images that evoked the final unveiling of that cosmic ledger, reminiscent of Surah 1849. He would wake drenched in sweat, unsure whether this was a warning or an invitation. Zayn endured a rift with a friend at his mosque, who criticized him for spending too much time with non-Muslims, ignoring that the Prophet himself interacted with people of all backgrounds. The tension stung him, planting seeds of resentment that threatened to overshadow his spiritual clarity. Yet despite these tribulations, the trio stayed connected. They met for occasional dinners at a modest Middle Eastern restaurant near the nonprofit's office. Over aromatic plates of rice, lamb, and lentil soup, they'd share updates on the refugee families, talk about new donors or volunteers, and inevitably wander back to the big questions of life. Sometimes they'd discuss passages from the Quran, sometimes from modern self-help books, sometimes from ancient poetry, always weaving these diverse strands into a tapestry that reflected their varied backgrounds. Adam noticed how Mark, once casually dismissive, now listened with rapt attention whenever he or Zayn spoke of Islamic teachings. Zayn noticed how Adam, though a convert, sometimes possessed a zeal that surpassed even those born into the faith. Mark noted how Zayn, outwardly so devout, harbored unspoken doubts about hypocrisy and injustice within certain religious circles. Each recognized that a hidden depth connected them, like three tributaries flowing toward an unseen ocean. On a bright Saturday morning, they decided to take a trip outside the city, not for official work but simply to explore. They drove west, following the old highway that snaked through canyons and over plateaus. The sky overhead was a boundless blue, broken only by a few stray clouds. They stopped at a vista point overlooking a wide gorge carved by centuries of rainfall, the rocks tinted layers of red, orange, and white. Standing at the guardrail, they felt the immensity of creation pressing gently on their souls. Adam murmured a prayer under his breath, thanking God for the beauty of the earth. Mark took slow, meditative breaths, as if absorbing the serenity into his very cells. Zayn recited a short verse from the Quran that praises the one who created the mountains and valleys, words that seemed to merge with the wind. In that hush of awe, they realized that they were indeed three very different people, one who believed ardently, one who questioned continuously, and one who seemed poised between certainty and disillusionment. Yet all three shared an unspoken commitment to seeking truth, a sentiment echoing Moses' determination in Surah 18 hours 60 minutes. Perhaps, they mused, they were each other's teachers and students, an unending circle of learning. The differences that at first seemed so stark, differences of origin, upbringing, and commitment, began to appear as complementary facets of a single quest. Much like the verse that speaks of the day the book is laid bare, they each were increasingly aware that their lives were open and visible to the divine. Nothing they hid would remain hidden. Their illusions might crumble under the searing light of that final reality. But it was precisely that vulnerability that gave life color and urgency, that demanded genuine compassion, humility, and courage. They lingered at the overlook for some time, each man quiet with his own reflections. As they finally turned back to the car, the wind picked up, carrying a scent of sage and distant rain. The sky above them remained bright, yet there was a feeling of approaching change in the air. They climbed into the car, and as the engine roared to life, they knew their journey, both outward and inward, was only beginning. Some invisible tide was pulling them, much like the unstoppable momentum that drove Moses forward in the ancient account. Whatever lay at the junction of their personal seas, they sensed they would have to face it together. They departed, the desert once again unfurling in sweeping vistas of rock and brush. The conversation turned to speculation, about life's purpose, about whether faith could offer a stable foundation in an increasingly turbulent world, and about whether differences were an obstacle or a path to deeper wisdom. Adam invoked the example of Islamic scholars who, across centuries, preserved knowledge and engaged in spirited debate without tearing the community apart. Zayn offered the viewpoint that all creation, in essence, points back to the Creator, making the apparent multiplicity of worldviews just varied reflections of a single reality. Mark listened, enthralled yet still hesitant. By dusk, they had returned to the outskirts of the city, greeted by the familiar neon lights of gas stations and fast food joints. The enchantment of the wild desert gave way to the humdrum of everyday life. Yet something of that ancient, wind-swept resonance clung to them like dust. Each parted with a warm handshake and a promise to meet again soon, but none could quite articulate the subtle transformation they sensed in each other's eyes. That night, in homes scattered across the sprawling city, they dreamed of passages from the Quran, of swirling sands and hidden teachers, of cosmic ledgers that recorded every thought and action. And in the hush between dreams, they heard an echo of a divine invitation, an urging to step more fully into the journey, no matter how uncertain. The three were drawn together by that ineffable chord, each a distinct note in a growing harmony. Little did they know that circumstances would soon conspire to test them further, like characters in a modern parable that mirrored the verses of old. They were unaware of exactly when it began to happen, but a subtle shift was taking place in their lives, a deepening awareness that turned casual conversations into revelations and ordinary days into layered, quietly urgent experiences. Before, when they discussed faith or the plight of displaced families, it felt like skimming the surface of a vast lake. Now, they found themselves plunging into deeper waters, propelled by a desire for true understanding. Each of the three friends recognized that this was no ordinary camaraderie. Something mysterious was weaving them together, entangling their destinies in a way reminiscent of the ancient stories they often discussed. One bright afternoon, Mark arrived at the nonprofit's office visibly shaken. He had spent the weekend volunteering at a youth shelter and had witnessed a harrowing incident involving a teenager on the brink of homelessness. The details were messy and raw, an argument, a flash of violence, an unspoken trauma simmering just below the surface. Mark, who generally kept a calm demeanor, described the night in broken fragments that revealed a profound impact on him. The boy, only 16, had run away from home after a series of family disputes. Mark had tried to console him, recalling the compassion he'd seen Zane and Adam display in the refugee camp. Despite his best efforts, the teenager had slipped away from the shelter before dawn. Now Mark was gripped by guilt and a gnawing sense of helplessness. Adam listened with pained empathy, and Zane placed a comforting hand on Mark's shoulder, urging him not to blame himself. After all, they were not omnipotent. They could only do their best and trust that mercy and guidance ultimately lay with the Almighty. Mark nodded, though his eyes betrayed a deeper torment. Something about this boy's story connected with Mark's own sense of spiritual dislocation. He felt as though they were both wandering through life, searching for a stable harbor. That evening, Adam invited both friends to his apartment, a modest, book-lined space. Shelves sagged under the weight of tomes on Islamic history, comparative religion, social justice, and philosophy. The walls were decorated with simple calligraphy prints of Quranic verses in swirling Arabic script. The three of them sat cross-legged on the floor, sipping tea, the aroma of cardamom and mint filling the quiet. Outside, the sky was fading from the brazen gold of sunset to a subdued lavender, the city lights beginning to shimmer in the distance. Adam began reading aloud from an English translation of Surah 18, specifically the verses that recount the encounter of Moses with the mysterious teacher, sometimes identified as Khidr, who performed seemingly baffling actions to teach Moses about patience and the hidden wisdom of the divine plan. Adam's voice rose and fell with a solemn cadence, the teacher scuttling a boat to save poor fishermen from oppression, killing a boy to protect him from future wrongdoing, rebuilding a crumbling wall to preserve a hidden treasure for orphans. Each act made no sense to Moses at first, yet in the end, each was revealed to be part of a larger scheme designed by God's mercy. I can't pretend to fully grasp it, Adam admitted softly, closing the book. But it reminds me there's always more to the story than we see. What appears tragic or unfair might conceal a blessing or a greater justice in the long run. Zane nodded, though a hint of turbulence flickered in his expression. He had grown up with that narrative, hearing imams and elders describe the lesson that mortal minds might not comprehend divine wisdom. Yet Zane wondered if that explanation had sometimes been used to excuse passivity in the face of suffering or injustice. He wanted to reconcile absolute trust in God's plan with the responsibility to act decisively for what was right. Life rarely offered neat answers. Still, he recognized that the story in Surah 18 championed humility, an acknowledgement that humans cannot always see the bigger picture. Mark cradled his cup, absorbing the words in contemplative silence. He pictured the runaway teenager from the shelter, wondering if that grim story, too, had a hidden angle that might ultimately lead to redemption. The older he got, the more he recognized that tragedies sometimes blossomed into second chances. But he remained haunted by the possibility of irreversible loss, the sense that failing to intervene at a crucial juncture could condemn someone to a lifetime of sorrow. He glanced around Adam's cozy apartment, feeling a flicker of envy at the clarity of conviction that Islam seemed to provide for Adam and Zane. Was it truly clarity, or was he projecting? The question nodded in his mind. That night, they parted with subdued goodbyes. In the days that followed, each returned to a complicated personal sphere. Mark became consumed with the search for the missing boy, coordinating with staff at the shelter, even driving through certain parts of the city known for transient youth populations. Adam, immersed in tasks at the nonprofit, encountered families from Somalia, Afghanistan, and Myanmar, all bearing their own searing stories of displacement and resilience. The relentless magnitude of their struggles sometimes left him numb, and he found himself praying more frequently, seeking both comfort and the strength to carry on. Zayn wrestled with internal conflicts at his mosque. He had once believed the community to be perfectly united, but now he saw cracks, disagreements over financial transparency, over outreach efforts to non-Muslims, and even over how strictly certain rituals should be observed. The friction was eroding his sense of spiritual security. Late one evening, they reconvened on a quiet residential street after having dinner separately with their own acquaintances. The night air was mild, carrying the scent of newly watered lawns and distant traffic. Streetlights cast yellow halos on the pavement as the three strolled aimlessly, as if drawn together by an unspoken urge. Their conversation began lightly, drifting from trivial observations about daily life to reflections on how fragile everything seemed. Eventually, Mark confided that he still hadn't located the teenager, but the search had put him in contact with various faith-based charities. He spoke of meeting an elderly pastor who said something that struck him like a bolt of lightning: "Even a lost sheep has a shepherd who never stops searching." Mark's voice trembled slightly at the recollection. He admitted that in his heart, he couldn't shake the notion that perhaps God, however Mark conceived of the divine, might be that tireless shepherd. Zayn listened intently, thinking of the countless parables in the Quran that highlight God's all-encompassing mercy. Adam was reminded of a hadith he'd once read, describing how God's love surpasses even that of a mother for her child. They walked until they reached a modest park where a single swing set and slide were lit by dull, flickering bulbs. Children were nowhere to be seen at this hour. The three men settled onto a weathered bench, the creak of the wood punctuating the hush. Overhead, a few stars burned faintly through the city's glow. Mark rummaged in his jacket pocket and withdrew a small, well-worn piece of paper. It was a verse from Surah 18 he had jotted down the day Adam read it aloud. With a shaky breath, Mark read, "Moses said, 'If Allah wills, you will find me patient, and I will not disobey you in any matter.'" He stared at the words for a long moment, then turned to Adam and Zayn. "That's the part where Moses vows obedience to the teacher, right? Even though Moses doesn't comprehend his actions." Adam nodded. "Right. It's about surrendering to the possibility that God's wisdom might manifest in ways we can't rationally grasp." Mark exhaled and folded the paper carefully. "I keep thinking about how hard that is. Patience and obedience, especially when you're in the dark. It's like stepping off a cliff, trusting you'll be caught." Zayn murmured, "It's faith in the unseen." Islam emphasizes that belief in the unseen is foundational, accepting that not all truths are immediately obvious. But we have signs everywhere, if we only observe. The challenge is to remain steadfast, even when we can't see the end. A faint breeze ruffled the trees, carrying the scent of jasmine from a nearby garden. Adam noticed the way Mark's gaze lingered on the sky, as though hoping for a celestial sign. Zayn, too, appeared deep in thought, his shoulders tense as though weighed down by personal dilemmas he hadn't yet voiced. Adam recognized that each of them harbored silent burdens. He realized that this moment, this park bench under the shimmering streetlights, held a significance that went beyond mere talk. They were like pilgrims huddled together in the night, confessing their vulnerabilities before an unseen presence. Something about that realization compelled Adam to speak from the heart. "I know we're each carrying questions," he said gently. "But the Quran promises that those who strive in God's way will be guided. That's a promise that resonates across faiths, I think. We have to keep striving, even if we stumble." Their conversation wound on past midnight, venturing into quiet recollections of each man's youth. Mark recalled how, as a teenager, he had stolen a small sum of money from his mother's purse to buy a train ticket and run away for a weekend, only to return, ashamed, on a cold Monday morning. He'd never apologized, too proud to admit his wrongdoing. He wondered if that stolen money was recorded in his own book of deeds, waiting to be addressed. Adam admitted that long before his conversion, he had treated religion as an object of ridicule, mocking classmates who attended Bible study. He felt remorse for those childish cruelties now, convinced they, too, were written in an eternal ledger. Zayn shared a story about a friend who had once confided in him about a grave sin, trusting him to keep it secret. Zayn had later divulged it to another confidant in a moment of weakness. That betrayal still haunted him. The notion of the final book, which would lay bare their every transgression, hovered between them like a silent witness. And yet they found solace in recalling that the Quran also speaks of forgiveness, of mercy that can blot out sins as though they never were. The tension between accountability and grace was palpable, shining a light on the moral gravitas of existence. Every action counted, yet redemption was always within reach. By the time they rose from the bench, the sky had deepened into a moonlit hush, and a few windows across the street had gone dark. As they slowly made their way back to their cars, they sensed a new layer of transparency in their friendship. It was as if the illusions they used to hide behind, pretenses of certainty or nonchalance, had begun to peel away, exposing raw hopes and fears. When they parted, no words could capture the moment's weight, so they simply clasped one another's hands in gratitude. The next morning arrived with an unexpected turn. The city awoke to news reports of a sudden policy change that threatened to expel some of the newer asylum seekers who had not yet completed their paperwork. At the non-profit, chaos erupted. Families frantic with worry flooded the waiting room, children crying in confusion. Adam and Zayn scrambled to contact legal aid partners, while Mark tried to calm everyone, handing out water and tissues, offering reassurance where he could. Tempers flared. There were heated debates about whether the organization had the means to help so many so quickly. Administrators disagreed on strategies, and tension rippled through the staff like a tremor before an earthquake. Around midday, a small group of frustrated asylum seekers began protesting outside the building, holding hand-painted signs demanding fair treatment. Though the demonstration was peaceful, it signaled how dire the situation had become. Mark stepped outside to speak with them, hoping to diffuse any growing anger. His attempts at reassurance felt inadequate, and he could see the desperation in their eyes. Then, amid the small crowd, he spotted a familiar face, the runaway boy he'd been searching for, standing near the back, nervously holding an empty water bottle. Time seemed to slow. Mark's breath caught. For a moment, he doubted his own eyes. But then the boy looked up, recognized Mark, and froze. There was a blend of fear and relief on his face, as though uncertain whether to approach or flee. With cautious steps, Mark drew closer. They exchanged tentative words, the boy admitting that he had drifted through various shelters before ending up here, trying to blend in, uncertain how else to survive. Mark's heart ached at the vulnerability in the teenager's voice. Without hesitation, he brought the boy inside, found him a quiet corner away from the chaos, and handed him some water. Their conversation was halting and raw. The teenager revealed that he had nowhere to go and no one to trust. Adam, returning from a chaotic phone call with an immigration lawyer, noticed Mark crouched beside the boy. A series of silent glances passed between them, and Adam's expression softened with immediate understanding. He joined them, quietly offering what help he could. Zayn soon followed, carrying paperwork for the asylum seekers, but paused when he saw the intensity of the moment. Suddenly, the swirl of bureaucratic pandemonium receded into the background. They were three friends, once again confronted by the tangible reality of suffering, and drawn together by an unspoken duty to serve. For the rest of that day, the three devoted every spare moment to helping the boy, contacting social workers, a youth outreach program, even some local imams who might provide a network of safe housing. By nightfall, an arrangement had been made for temporary placement in a supervised living facility, where he could get counseling and education support. The teenager's eyes brimmed with relief, though he remained guarded, as one who has learned not to trust too easily. Nevertheless, the flicker of hope in his face warmed Mark's heart in ways he hadn't anticipated. Amid the exhaustion of that chaotic day, the three friends regrouped in the nonprofit's empty conference room after hours, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The office was eerily still, the earlier crowd long gone. Seated around a small table scattered with file folders and paper cups, they exhaled in unison, as though releasing a shared burden. "It's been surreal," Mark muttered, leaning back, his eyes bloodshot from fatigue. "But he's safe, at least for now." "I can't stop thinking how that encounter felt, orchestrated, in a way. I mean, of all places." Zane pressed his fingertips together thoughtfully. "Sometimes the signs are subtle, sometimes they're not. Maybe this was meant to show you that your efforts, your prayers, your concerns, they weren't in vain." Adam recalled the story of the boat being scuttled to save the fisherman. He couldn't help drawing a parallel. At first glance, it had seemed tragic that the boy ran away. But perhaps that dark moment had led him to where he could find real help. Adam spoke slowly, trying to capture the thought. "We never know how events connect. But maybe this is a small glimpse, like a thread we can actually see in the grand tapestry." The conversation drifted to the deeper spiritual dimension, how Surah 18 repeatedly underscores that human perception is limited, and that trust in divine wisdom can illuminate even the bleakest circumstance. The three men found themselves reflecting on all the other refugees and displaced souls. Not all stories ended so neatly. What about the countless individuals who slipped through cracks, never to be found? Were their lost hopes accounted for in the same divine plan? A gentle silence took hold, leaving room for both gratitude and grief. Zane cleared his throat, compelled to admit something he'd been wrestling with. "I've been feeling a conflict at the mosque. Some people there, they say we should stick to our own, focus on our community's needs first. They make it seem like working with non-Muslims or with certain kinds of refugees is a distraction. It makes me angry. Isn't the Quran universal? Didn't the Prophet, peace be upon him, teach us compassion for all?" Adam's face tightened. He understood the sting of religious gatekeeping, how it could corrode the spirit. Those attitudes are exactly what push people away. We can't forget that the Prophet welcomed people from all walks of life. The Quran calls us to stand for justice, for truth, wherever that might be. Mark observed them, profoundly moved by the sincerity of their words. "I guess any belief system can be twisted by fear or narrow-mindedness," he said quietly. "But it's reassuring to see how you both fight that from the inside." They agreed that hypocrisy and insularity could arise in any faith community or ideological group, a reminder that the real struggle for sincerity was always ongoing. In that late-hour conference room, the three recognized that their own differences, once awkward and tentative, had become a shared strength. Adam's fervor, Mark's openness, and Zane's conscientious commitment each played a role in protecting that runaway boy, in comforting the anxious families, and in challenging cynicism wherever it appeared. Finally, they left the office, their footsteps echoing in the deserted hallway. Outside, the air was crisp, the moon high and radiant. They paused for a moment, letting the stillness envelop them. A single street lamp buzzed overhead, casting a circle of pale light on the sidewalk. It was well past normal working hours, and the city seemed to be dozing in fragile peace. Adam offered a quiet prayer of thanks, Mark closed his eyes in reflection, and Zane simply breathed in the moment, inhaling both the weight of all they had seen and a sense of renewed hope. Over the following weeks, the city's policy crisis simmered. Many asylum seekers faced the threat of deportation, their fate tangled in legal red tape. The non-profit mobilized every resource, forging alliances with local mosques, churches, and secular advocacy groups. Adam and Zane took on extra responsibilities, working with lawyers to prepare the relevant documents, while Mark organized donation drives, ensuring that families who might be forced to move still had blankets, food, and basic necessities. The strain was immense. It was not uncommon to find staff in tears, overwhelmed by the magnitude of need. Yet amid the turmoil, seeds of solidarity sprouted between various local organizations that once barely acknowledged each other. Synagogues, temples, masjids, and community centers united in a collective push, exemplifying the Quranic principle of cooperation in righteousness. One evening, as Adam was leaving the office, he passed by an older woman in the waiting area, hunched over in exhaustion, a patterned scarf slipping from her gray hair. She looked up, and in her eyes Adam perceived a silent plea. He approached gently, his voice low. She spoke little English, but he learned through gestures and broken phrases that she was from Syria, that she had lost 2 sons in the conflict, and that she had nowhere else to turn. She carried a tattered copy of the Quran in her handbag, and when she clutched it to her chest, Adam felt a pang of sorrow and reverence. She was the living embodiment of Surah 18's lessons on fortitude and trust, a figure battered by unimaginable adversity yet still clinging to faith. He assured her that help was available, though he couldn't promise miracles. She bowed her head, eyes misty, repeating what sounded like a prayer of gratitude in Arabic. Adam placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. In his mind, he thought of the day of judgment, how each human being would stand before the Almighty, their deeds laid bare, the hidden pains and sacrifices finally seen and accounted for. He wondered if that cosmic unveiling might, in fact, be a mercy for those who had suffered in silence, whose tragedies had gone unrecognized in this world. Night fell by the time Adam left, emotionally drained yet strangely buoyed by a renewed conviction. Outside, the moonlight cast soft shadows, and as he headed to his car, he glimpsed Mark and Zane in the parking lot, each finishing a long shift. They gathered in the dim glow of a security lamp, exchanging weary smiles. No words were needed to express what they felt, a mixture of exhaustion, hope, and the sobering realization that the struggle was far from over. Zane pulled out his phone to check the time. It was well after 9 in the evening. Mark suggested they grab a late dinner at a nearby diner, a favorite haunt of college students and night shift workers. It was a battered old place with chipped formica tables and neon signs. They found a booth by the window, sinking into the seats with relief. The waitress, recognizing them from past visits, greeted them warmly and took their orders, coffee all around, plus a few plates of simple fare. As they waited, their conversation took on a reflective tone, like soldiers debriefing after a hard-fought battle. Mark described the progress of the runaway teenager, who was beginning to attend classes and had joined a small support group. Zane shared news about a local imam who planned to speak at an interfaith rally, urging city officials to reconsider their stance on asylum seekers. Adam mentioned the elderly Syrian woman he had just met. He couldn't get her out of his mind, the depth of her sorrow mixed with resilience. Their food arrived, warm and comforting, and they ate in pensive silence for a few minutes. Outside, the lights of passing cars glinted in the darkness, and the hum of conversation from other patrons offered a soothing backdrop. Eventually, Mark spoke up, voice quivering slightly with vulnerability. "I think I'm beginning to see what faith can do," he said, eyes fixed on the steam rising from his coffee. "Not as a set of rigid rules, but as a force that galvanizes people to stand up for each other, to share burdens no one should carry alone." Zane nodded slowly. "That's the heart of it, I believe. Submission to God isn't just bowing in prayer, it's bending our will toward compassion, toward justice. And that's hard. It's easier to stay wrapped in our own concerns." Adam, touched by Mark's openness, leaned forward. "It's about living with the awareness that we're accountable. Not just to a cosmic record, but to each other, because we're all part of this creation. If the Quran teaches anything, it's that worldly illusions, wealth, pride, will fade. What remains are the real deeds, the sincerity of our hearts." A hush settled over them. For a moment, the din of the diner receded, replaced by an almost sacred silence. In that fragile stillness, each man felt an unspoken gratitude for the other's presence, for the synergy of their diverse beliefs and doubts that somehow sparked a shared purpose. It dawned on them that they were living their own parable, perhaps not as grand as the story of Moses and his mysterious teacher, but no less guided by hidden wisdom. They lingered at the table long after their plates were cleared, immersed in thoughts that words could barely capture. By the time they stepped outside, the sky was an inky backdrop to the glowing city skyline. They parted with an unspoken promise to persevere, each returning to his dwelling with a fuller, heavier heart. Sleep would find them eventually, filled with vivid dreams and silent prayers for the wounded souls they had encountered. And, somewhere in the swirling cosmos, the invisible ink of their own deeds, compassion, doubt, courage, missteps, continued to be recorded, line by line, awaiting the day everything would be laid bare. It was a quiet drive home for each of them, headlights illuminating deserted streets, the hush of late-night radio filling the car interiors. They thought of Surah 18 again, the stories of the sleepers of the cave, the parables of wealth and humility, the journey of Moses, the final reminder of the book that spares no detail. Against that ancient tapestry, their modern struggles were but a single thread, yet they sensed that every thread mattered. Each story, each act of kindness or lapse of empathy, each choice to trust or despair, all of it interwove into the grand design. Even the differences between them, once a source of potential discord, had become the crucible where they honed their understanding of life's sacred depth. Night merged into early morning, the city's pulse slowing almost to a standstill. In the dim corners of small apartments, the three friends found fitful rest. They dreamed of swirling sands and shimmering seas, of lost boys and pious elders, of ancient revelations that spoke as loudly today as they had centuries ago. In the hush between dreams, they sensed the echo of a divine call, urging them onward, bidding them to transcend their fears and illusions. If they listened carefully, they could almost hear the turning of unseen pages, recording each breath, each silent hope, each resolve to do better next time. The days stretched on, and under the glare of the midday sun or in the dim hush of early morning, the three friends often found themselves side by side, shepherding anxious families through the labyrinth of documentation and hearings. It was work that demanded patience, empathy, and sheer stamina, none of which came easily as the city's political climate grew more divisive. Occasionally, harsh murmurs reached their ears, resentful whispers suggesting these newcomers were undeserving of aid, or that their plight was self-inflicted. But even amidst such tension, Adam, Mark, and Zane pressed forward, each in his own manner. They believed the invisible thread that first pulled them together had tightened, forging a stronger unity. Mark's search for spiritual grounding took on a sharper edge. In brief lulls at the office, he began reading not just Surah 18 but other passages from the Quran, along with reflections from a wide variety of thinkers, Imam Ghazali, Martin Luther King Jr., Desmond Tutu, and even Buddhist teachings on compassion. He didn't call himself a Muslim or any other label, but a quiet stirring grew in him, as if something within whispered that life's mysteries beckoned him to commitment. He struggled, though, unable to reconcile the intellectual acceptance of divine guidance with his nagging habit of doubt. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would jolt awake, heart racing, haunted by an image of the cosmic book that Surah 18 warned would expose every hidden deed. Yet there was also a strange comfort in the idea that all illusions would be stripped away, leaving only truth. Adam noticed Mark's reading habits but refrained from probing. He remembered his own journey into Islam, how external pressure had only triggered more resistance in him. Genuine conviction, he believed, flourished best when watered by free exploration. Meanwhile, Adam was immersed in personal challenges that tested his spiritual resilience. He had a brother who lived several states away, a man who had once been Adam's closest confidant. Their relationship had cooled since Adam's conversion. Now, out of the blue, that brother called with startling news: their father had fallen gravely ill, and nobody knew if he would recover. Duty and love pulled Adam back to his biological family's orbit, a realm complicated by old grievances and misunderstandings about his faith. "I'm going to need some time off," Adam told Mark and Zane one late afternoon, his tone heavy. They stood near the nonprofit's lobby, where tired parents sat in plastic chairs, waiting for the next available caseworker. The hum of overhead lights buzzed against the hush. "I have to see my father. Not sure how long I'll be gone." Zane's brow furrowed with concern. "We'll cover for you. Don't worry about the workload, just take care of your family." Mark nodded emphatically. "Yes, do what you need to do. We'll manage here." A few days later, Adam boarded a plane to the small town where his parents still lived. As he walked through the jetway, he clutched his worn pocket-sized Quran, reminding himself of verses about filial piety, about how honoring one's parents was central in Islam. Yet a part of him dreaded the awkward reunions, the forced small talk. After all, He knew the suspicion that lurked behind some relatives' eyes whenever religion came up. He swallowed hard, resolving to face whatever awaited him with the humility Surah 18 had instilled in him, that sense of a cosmic narrative in which every twist had a purpose, if only he maintained patience and sincerity. Back in the city, Mark and Zane picked up the slack, dividing Adam's cases between them and working late into the night. Zane's schedule overflowed, and he found himself on the verge of burnout, sleeping just 4 or 5 hours a night, catching quick naps on a battered couch in the office break room. He reminded himself of the Prophet's example: kindness and diligence, yes, but also moderation. One evening, after finishing a consultation with a frightened Afghan mother of 3, he locked his office door and slumped into his chair, the overhead fluorescent flickering ominously. He felt an uncomfortable swirl of resentment and fatigue. He had prayed Dur, Asr, Maghrib, and was nearing time for Isha. Usually, prayer was his anchor. But in that moment, an unsettling question rose in him: why am I being tested like this? If our intentions are good, why is everything so hard? His mind drifted to the story in Surah 18, where the youth sought refuge in a cave, and God miraculously preserved them. Was it easier for them? He murmured under his breath. He immediately felt guilty for voicing such a thought, knowing that an ancient miracle shouldn't be compared to his modern hustle. But the frustration was real, a crack in his usually steadfast demeanor. Sighing, he rose, performed his ablutions in the restroom, then spread a small prayer rug in the corner of his office. In the stillness of that short prayer, his tension eased. By the time he folded up the rug, he sensed a little more calm, as though the swirling confusion had abated, replaced by the subtle reassurance that comes from turning oneself over to the unseen. Meanwhile, Mark was working even later than Zane. With Adam gone, many of the newly arrived families gravitated toward Mark, remembering his warmth and promise to help. A sense of responsibility weighed on him. He often found himself muttering silent prayers, unsure exactly to whom he was praying. At times, he would open the copy of the Quran Adam had gifted him, searching for answers to the swirl of questions that inundated him. One passage in particular: or have you thought that the companions of the cave and the inscription were a wonder among our signs? Resonated with him. It seemed to imply that the miraculous was woven into the very fabric of existence, and that what humans deemed extraordinary was but a small reflection of the boundless divine power. This notion unsettled and comforted him in equal measure. Late on a Friday night, Mark decided to drive out to the desert by himself, seeking the kind of stillness that the city's noise could never provide. He navigated winding roads until he reached a secluded spot where the starlight spilled across the landscape like scattered jewels. Parking his car on a patch of dirt, he stepped out, leaning against the hood. The cool night air carried a faint scent of sagebrush and distant creosote. Overhead, the sky was vast and indifferent, a cosmic tapestry that made the troubles of one city seem infinitesimally small. Yet Mark felt an inexplicable closeness to the infinite. He recalled lines from Surah 18 about how even the earth's greatest wonders pale before the ultimate knowledge of God. He whispered into the desert wind, "If you're there, guide me." The word sounded half-formed, awkward on his tongue. But a gentle wave of relief passed over him, as though the mere act of expressing his confusion brought him nearer to something real. He stayed there for nearly an hour, occasionally glancing at the luminous horizon, the hush broken only by the distant call of a coyote. Then he drove back, heart still heavy with uncertainty, but now carrying a flicker of willingness to trust, to keep asking, to keep seeking. Meanwhile, Adam's journey back home proved to be both painful and transformative. His father was bedridden, hooked up to an array of monitors and 4 drips in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. Adam's mother nodded a subdued greeting, her eyes rimmed with fatigue. His brother stood off to the side, arms folded. The tension in the room was palpable. When Adam approached the bed, his father managed a weak, perplexed smile. Despite everything, a father's love still shone in the old man's eyes. Over the next few days, Adam spent hours at the bedside, often reading quietly. Sometimes he recited Quranic verses under his breath, uncertain if his father understood. There were awkward, incomplete conversations, snippets about old family memories, about regrets, about love left unspoken for too long. One afternoon, when Adam was alone with his father, the older man opened his eyes and asked in a raspy voice, "You still believe in that, in Islam?" Adam's heart pounded, but he answered calmly, "Yes, Dad. I do." A silence passed, filled with the beeping of medical machines. Then his father nodded slowly, as if accepting something he could never fully comprehend. Adam felt tears slipping down his cheeks. He took his father's hand. The older man whispered, "If you believe, then pray for me." Adam, overwhelmed, bent forward, pressing his forehead gently to his father's hand. It was the closest thing to an acceptance he'd ever dreamed of receiving. He thought of the day of accountability, how every subtle moment of grace and connection was recorded. He silently invoked the merciful nature of the one who knows even the secrets we carry in our hearts. In that small hospital room, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, father and son reached a fragile reconciliation that transcended their differences. Adam remained by his side, lips moving in hushed duet, praying for healing, or if not healing, then peace. A few more days passed. His father's condition stabilized slightly, though the doctors were still cautious. On the final afternoon before Adam's return flight, his mother pulled him aside in the hallway. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she thanked him for coming, for not holding on to old resentments. She said she might never fully understand his conversion, but she respected the man he had become. Adam listened, speechless, feeling a knot in his chest loosen. It felt as if a long chapter of tension was closing, replaced by a gentler acceptance. He boarded the plane with a bittersweet heart, carrying the memory of his father's near whisper, "Pray for me." When Adam arrived back in the city, Mark and Zane were waiting for him at the airport, standing near the baggage claim among tourists and business travelers. Mark was the first to spot him, raising an arm in greeting. Zane let out a relieved grin. The three exchanged handshakes and a series of half-hugs, as if reuniting after a drawn-out war. Adam's expression told them everything: exhaustion, relief, grief, and a strange new tranquility. They drove him home in Zane's car, the conversation subdued at first, then warming into mutual updates. Mark mentioned a potential lead on additional funding for the nonprofit. Zane described how the local mosque was finally organizing a citywide interfaith event aimed at addressing the asylum crisis. Adam listened, comforted by the normalcy of their projects, though his mind was still partly in that hospital room. By the time they pulled up to Adam's modest apartment, night had fallen, and the city lights shimmered like scattered diamonds. They decided to spend the evening together. Mark stopped by a nearby Middle Eastern eatery for takeout, returning with steaming containers of spiced rice, roasted vegetables, and grilled chicken. In Adam's living room, the three spread out on the floor, using an old coffee table as a makeshift dining surface. Over dinner, Adam recounted the events back home. He spoke of the subtle blessing in reconciling with his father, the unexpected peace that came from simply being present. Zane listened with moist eyes, and Mark sat in rapt silence, as though absorbing a parable straight from Surah 18, replete with heartbreak and hidden mercy. As the meal ended, Adam cleared the food containers and disappeared briefly into his bedroom. He returned carrying a worn paperback that Mark recognized as a modern commentary on the Quran. Without preamble, Adam read a short excerpt that discussed how the experiences of daily life, family trials, moral decisions, moments of clarity, can mirror the great parables in Scripture. When he finished, the hush in the room felt almost sacred. Zane broke the silence. "Your father asked you to pray for him. That's incredible." He recalled the numerous verses in the Quran that instruct believers to honor their parents, even if they differ in faith. The idea of bridging that chasm resonated deeply in Zane's heart, especially as he grappled with divisions in his own mosque community. Mark exhaled, feeling a surge of emotion. It's like a small version of what the refugees face: family separation, fear of never reconciling. Yet sometimes walls do come down. He paused, eyes drifting to a corner of the room where a decorative plaque displayed a verse in Arabic calligraphy. It gives me hope, he added softly. They talked late into the night, the conversation winding through personal reflections and broader questions about destiny, free will, and the inscrutable currents of divine wisdom. At one point, Zayn mused about Moses' journey with his enigmatic companion in Surah 18. Moses questioned everything he saw, sinking the boat, killing the boy, rebuilding the wall. He couldn't fathom why such actions were taken. But in the end, each had a reason, a hidden mercy. Maybe that's the lesson of all this. We see only the surface, but if we have patience, the deeper truth might be unveiled. Mark leaned back against the couch, letting out a contemplative sigh. I want to believe that. I really do. His tone was tinged with longing. Sometimes I think I'm close, like I'm standing at the doorstep of something profound. But I keep hesitating, afraid to step through. Adam, sensing Mark's inner struggle, recalled his own wavering steps before embracing Islam. I can tell you from experience, it won't ever feel completely risk-free. But if it's real, that leap of faith is worth it. Zayn nodded but said nothing, perhaps knowing that Mark's journey had to unfold in its own time. They lingered a little longer, until fatigue began to weigh on their eyelids. One by one, they bid each other good night, slipping out into the cool darkness of the city. Zayn drove Mark home, and Adam remained behind, alone with his thoughts in the quiet apartment. In the following weeks, a whirlwind of events unfolded. The city's policy regarding asylum seekers was challenged in court, leading to heated debates and televised rallies. The non-profit found itself in the public eye, praised by some for its dedication, vilified by others who saw it as overly sympathetic to outsiders. The tension on the streets was palpable, with rumors of official raids that might forcibly remove families who had overstayed their initial permits. Volunteers arrived in droves to help, while certain factions staged counter-protests, calling for stricter enforcement. Amid this storm, Zayn poured himself into the mosque's interfaith committee. He participated in endless meetings, forging alliances with pastors, rabbis, priests, and other community leaders who sought a humane resolution. At times, he worried about friction within his mosque, but he was heartened by a growing number of congregants who supported his outreach. They cited Islamic teachings on justice and compassion, referencing the Prophet's practice of forging treaties and alliances. One Friday's sermon even included a reflection on Surah 18, highlighting that the moral lessons within it apply to every era, urging believers to stand firm against oppression. Adam, too, found renewed resolve. Between the unresolved fears about his father's health and the confrontations at work, he prayed more fervently than ever. It was as though the hardships sharpened his commitment. He volunteered for additional shifts, quietly assisting Mark in some of the more challenging cases. They labored to compile evidence, affidavits, and testimonies that might protect vulnerable families from deportation. Late into the night, the two would sift through documents in a cramped office, fueled by coffee and a dogged sense of purpose. One particular case stood out, a widowed Iraqi woman with a 7-year-old daughter who had lost her father during sectarian violence. They had nowhere to go, no relatives willing to sponsor them. The woman spoke tearfully of being threatened back in her home country. Every detail spelled heartbreak, and the child's eyes seemed haunted by the ghost of the father she barely remembered. Mark and Adam fought desperately to secure a stay of removal, citing the mortal danger that awaited them if deported. In a moment of quiet, after the mother had stepped out, Mark confessed how deeply the case disturbed him. "It's like I can't sleep," he murmured. "I keep imagining them being forced onto a plane. Then what? Another tragedy, unrecorded by the world. How do we reconcile that with the notion of a loving creator?" Adam exhaled, recalling the hospital room and his father's plea for prayer. "We do what we can. We trust that God sees everything, even if this world's systems fail. And we pray for an outcome that aligns with mercy. Sometimes all we can do is stand at the limit of our power and plead for divine intervention." Those words stayed with Mark. He found himself praying that night, in his own stumbling way, that the Iraqi widow and her daughter would find refuge. In the morning, it felt strange yet comforting to realize he had prayed so earnestly. Though he still hesitated to label it faith, he felt the faint pulse of something akin to devotion. The tension in the city came to a head on a rainy afternoon, a rare downpour that blanketed the streets in a curtain of silver. Water gushed from overloaded drains, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Word spread that federal agents had arrived to process certain high-priority deportations. Panic swept through the immigrant communities. Zayn rushed to the mosque, which had opened its doors as a temporary sanctuary. Adam and Mark stayed at the nonprofit's office, guiding terrified families who showed up drenched and trembling, unsure where else to turn. Rain-soaked flyers plastered the windows, reading, "Support refugees," and "No one is illegal." The phone rang incessantly, calls from volunteers, from lawyers, from city council members. Mark could scarcely keep pace, sweat beading on his forehead as he juggled phone lines and scrawled messages. Adam navigated the hallways, distributing towels and cups of hot tea, offering calm reassurances. The staff worked like triage medics in a crisis zone, each trying to shield the vulnerable from looming disaster. Outside, a crowd of protesters gathered, some in solidarity, others chanting slogans demanding stricter enforcement. The clash of voices, mixed with the drumming rain, created a surreal cacophony. At the height of this turmoil, Mark glanced through the glass door and saw the Iraqi widow clinging to her daughter's hand, both soaked to the skin. Mark sprinted outside, ignoring the water sloshing into his shoes. He ushered them inside, pulling out a couple of blankets. The woman's face registered sheer terror. She murmured, "They're coming, aren't they?" Her voice cracked. Mark knelt beside her, wrapping her daughter in a blanket. A tear trailed down his cheek. "We're doing everything possible. You are not alone." In that moment, Adam emerged from a hallway with an immigration lawyer. They hustled the mother and child into a small office. What followed was a tense scramble of phone calls, last-minute petition filings, and hurried translations. Lightning flashed, and thunder rumbled overhead, as though nature itself was embroiled in the drama. Hours later, news arrived: a judge had granted an emergency stay, thanks to new evidence the lawyer had managed to fax at the 11th hour. The widow broke down in relief, clutching her daughter so tightly it seemed she might never let go. Mark and Adam shared a trembling smile, their eyes wet with tears of gratitude. Outside, the sky began to clear, the rain easing to a gentle patter. Toward evening, the frenzy began to subside. Families trickled out, some returning to temporary shelters, others to the mosque. Zayn called to say the situation at the mosque had calmed as well, fewer people now needed a place to hide. The city's tension had not vanished, but a fragile peace hung in the air, as if everyone was too exhausted for further confrontation. Night fell, bringing an exhausted hush. One by one, the staff and volunteers departed. Adam and Mark remained in the lobby, slumped on chairs, the lights dimmed. They listened to the drip of water from their coats forming small puddles on the tiled floor. Mark eventually broke the silence, voice hoarse from the day's stress. "We saved some lives today." Adam nodded, too drained to speak. Mark turned toward him, his gaze intense. This is what faith is about, right? Standing for others, regardless of the cost." Adam nodded again, finding his voice. "Faith should transform us into protectors, guardians. Islam's not just theory, it's action, like what you did today." "You stood firm, Mark." A flicker of emotion crossed Mark's face, and he managed a weary laugh. "I don't even know if I'm a believer, but I prayed today. Hard. And something came through." Adam reached over, clasping his friend's shoulder. "Keep following that thread." In the days that followed, the intensity simmered down, though the underlying issues remained. Yet something had changed, not just in Mark's heart but in the city's collective spirit. Religious and community groups had been forced to confront each other, to debate, to collaborate. A messy transformation had begun, forging new ties across once hostile divides. Zayn took solace in seeing his mosque step into a more prominent role of public compassion, bridging the gap between faith and civic responsibility. Adam's empathy deepened, aware that every small action reverberated in that cosmic ledger from which no deed is missing. Mark, meanwhile, floated on a surge of cautious hope, as though sensing that the long corridor of skepticism he had wandered was guiding him, step by step, toward a doorway of light. One evening, as the three of them regrouped at Zane's apartment for a modest meal, pita, hummus, olives, and stewed lentils, they found themselves speaking in hushed, reflective tones. Zane's apartment was sparsely furnished, with a few religious art pieces on the walls, including a simple wooden plaque inscribed with Bismillah ir-Rahman ir-Rahim in swirling calligraphy. The windows overlooked a busy street, where cars and pedestrians blurred into the urban night. They sat on cushions around a low table. Through the open window, a warm breeze carried the echoes of traffic and distant laughter. Mark described how, earlier that day, he had guided the Iraqi widow and her daughter to a newly secured housing arrangement. Her relief had been almost tearful. "I couldn't help but see a reflection of the parables in Surah 18, he said quietly. People in dire straits, rescued in ways they never expected. They were like the boat that was nearly lost but ended up being saved from a worse fate." Zane tapped his fingers lightly on the table's edge, thinking about the boat Moses' teacher had scuttled. It's amazing how those ancient symbols keep manifesting in modern forms. There's a reason the Quran calls them signs. They're universal patterns in God's design. Adam, sipping from a glass of water, recalled an Arabic phrase about the Quran being timeless. Every generation sees these verses through their own lens, facing their own tribulations. The core lessons stay the same: humility, trust, and perseverance. Their talk meandered into reflections on the Day of Judgment, an idea that had hovered in the background of all their conversations. Mark confessed it both terrified and fascinated him. The thought of every hidden secret revealed, it's sobering. I think about the countless times I've turned a blind eye to suffering or indulged in selfish impulses. It's like, how does anyone stand on that day without trembling? Zane responded gently, we all tremble, but remember that God's mercy is vast. We strive, we repent, we keep trying. That's the heart of Islam. It's not a religion of despair. Adam set down his glass, gazing across at Mark. You're walking this path, whether you label it or not. I see it in your eyes. The questions you ask, the compassion you show, those are signs of faith growing within you. Mark's cheeks flushed slightly. He had never been comfortable discussing his own spiritual state so directly. Yet he felt strangely unburdened in their company. Leaning back, he spoke barely above a whisper, maybe. I just want to see the truth. Whether it's Islam or something else, I don't know. But I can't deny that I feel something stirring. They lingered over the meal, finishing with dates and hot tea. Time slipped by unnoticed, until the city outside grew quieter, fewer cars passing by. Eventually, they rose, tidied the small table, and prepared to depart. Zane looked at them with a reflective smile, as though something dawned on him. You know, I realize that the differences between us, convert, born Muslim, seeker, might be the biggest blessing. We keep each other balanced, like points of a triangle. Adam agreed. The Quran often speaks of diversity as a sign. Maybe it's exactly this interplay that helps us grow. Mark said nothing, but his eyes shone with gratitude. He thought of the many times he'd felt an outsider, drifting from one worldview to the next, never quite landing. Here, in this unlikely circle, he had found a sense of belonging he never expected. It was late when they finally said their goodbyes, stepping into the hallway of Zane's apartment building. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting elongated shadows on the walls. They parted, each heading to his own corner of the city, but bound by an unspoken unity. That night, alone in his darkened room, Mark found sleep elusive. He lay staring at the ceiling, replaying the recent flurry of experiences in his mind. The thunderous day when the agents arrived, the quiet desert vigil under the stars, the tearful relief of the Iraqi widow, Adam's story of tentative reconciliation with his ailing father, Zane's tireless bridge building at the mosque. A single question kept pulsing through him: is this my path? Shortly before midnight, he rose, switched on a dim lamp, and retrieved the Quran commentary Adam had given him. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he flipped to Surah 18, scanning the lines about Moses, about the inscrutable teacher, about how each perplexing event concealed mercy in the end. Then he found himself whispering a line of prayer he had overheard Zayn recite once: "My Lord, expand for me my chest and ease for me my task." The words felt both alien and intimate, as though they were etched into his own yearning. His lips trembled as he spoke: "I'm ready to see what I haven't seen. Show me what's real." A long silence followed, in which Mark could hear only the distant hum of traffic and the faint tick of a clock. But in that silence, something in his heart shifted, like a seed pushing through the soil toward daylight. No dramatic epiphany overtook him, yet he felt an unexpected calm, as if he had finally dared to crack open a long-sealed door. He exhaled, setting the book on the nightstand, and pulled the covers around himself. Slowly, he drifted into sleep, carrying the prayer with him like a single flame in the darkness. Morning arrived with golden sunlight spilling through the blinds, illuminating floating dust motes that sparkled in the warmth. Mark woke with a sense of renewed energy, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Across town, Adam rose early for the dawn prayer, his mind reaching back to the memory of his father's frail voice: "Pray for me." Meanwhile, Zayn prepared for another day of balancing the needs of the mosque community with those of the nonprofit's refugees. The three men, each in his separate dwelling, were united by the intangible thread that had brought them together. And as the sun climbed higher, they stepped out into the bustling city, hearts poised on the verge of further discoveries, uncertain what trials or triumphs might lie ahead, yet resolved to continue seeking that hidden mercy, that deeper wisdom, hinted at in every verse of Surah 18. Long before the dawn call to prayer tinted the sky with pale light, Zayn woke in a restless state. He lay on his narrow bed, the sheets tangled around him, his mind thrumming with tension. For days, he had been coordinating an ambitious event at his mosque, an interfaith forum intended to address social injustices and the ongoing crisis of displaced families. He'd invited representatives from churches, synagogues, civic groups, and secular charities, hoping for a wide-ranging conversation that might heal some of the city's rifts. Yet the deeper he delved into this plan, the more pushback he received from certain mosque members who questioned the wisdom of opening their doors so widely. This internal friction tugged at the edges of his soul, compounding his mounting exhaustion. He finally rose, performed his ablutions, and recited the dawn prayer on a small rug facing east. In that stillness, he appealed to the Almighty for clarity. He remembered how in Surah 18, the companions of the cave had sought refuge from oppression, and how God had guided them in miraculous ways. Would a similar guidance extend to this modern quest for unity and understanding? The moment he concluded his final supplication, a curious peace settled over him, as though a gentle hand had quieted the turmoil within. He inhaled deeply, deciding to trust the path before him. Across town, Mark stirred in his sleep, slipping from one vivid dream to another. Since the tension-packed day when federal agents had arrived and families sought sanctuary at the nonprofit, his nighttime visions had grown increasingly charged with symbolic imagery. Often, he dreamed of the desert, a place of swirling sands and distant figures that beckoned him onward. Sometimes, he stood before a towering wall scrawled with verses in Arabic script he couldn't decipher. On this particular morning, he dreamed he was wading through a torrential flood, desperately clutching a small child's hand as they fought against the current. He awoke with a gasp, heart hammering, his mind still fogged by the dream's intensity. The early sunlight filtered through his curtains, illuminating the glint of sweat on his forehead. He lay there, thoughts drifting to Surah 18's parable of Moses and the mysterious teacher who drowned a boat. The memory sent a chill through him. In the story, the boat was damaged to spare its owners from a worse fate. Could his dream be a reflection of some spiritual truth, that certain hardships could prevent even greater tragedy? Groggy yet oddly resolute, Mark swung his legs out of bed. He thought of Adam, how his faith had deepened after confronting his father's illness, and of Zayn, so steadfast yet burdened by inner conflict. A subtle longing rose in Mark, a wish for the kind of certainty that both men seemed to carry, no matter how tested they were. By the time Mark finished showering and dressing, his mind settled on a plan for the day. He wanted to support Zane's interfaith forum, though he wasn't formally part of any religious congregation. He told himself he could attend as an observer, an ally from the nonprofit. Perhaps in witnessing the efforts of various faiths uniting for a common cause, he might glean insights into his own spiritual restlessness. Meanwhile, Adam was already at the office, flipping through a stack of documents that needed urgent attention. Despite his bleary eyes, he'd been up late returning calls from volunteers. He felt a spark of renewed optimism. His father's health had stabilized somewhat, and though Adam carried the weight of uncertainty, he treasured the newfound closeness they'd forged in that hospital room. Now, back in the city, Adam felt an almost urgent determination to pour his energies into the nonprofit's mission. Every case file he handled became a personal calling, every conversation with a distressed refugee a chance to show the mercy he believed was at the core of Islam's teachings. He glanced at the clock, realized the day would soon erupt into a flurry of appointments, and typed a quick text message to both friends, "Thinking of you too this morning. Let's touch base soon about the forum. Peace." He typed peace intentionally, hoping to invoke not just a friendly greeting, but the sense of tranquility they all seemed to need. Zane responded first, a short but sincere line, "Wa alaikum as salam. Thanks, brother. Could definitely use your help tonight." Mark replied a few minutes later with a thumbs-up emoji followed by, "Count me in. Let's make this event count." And so the day unfurled in its usual collage of tension and hope. Families shuffled through the nonprofit's entrance with anxious faces, some clutching official letters they couldn't read. Children played quietly in corners, while staff and volunteers coordinated housing leads or legal documentation. Adam darted from desk to desk, assisting co-workers who were overwhelmed. Mark arrived mid-morning, diving straight into a backlog of phone calls. From time to time, they caught each other's eyes across the crowded room and exchanged nods, as if reaffirming a silent pact. By late afternoon, the office began to calm. Mark and Adam packed up to head over to the mosque, where Zane was already busy setting up chairs, arranging refreshments, and greeting early arrivals. The mosque stood in a neighborhood that had once been predominantly Muslim but now boasted a diverse tapestry of cultures and religions. A tall minaret overlooked the street, while the building itself blended traditional Islamic architecture with a modern facade. Stepping inside, Mark felt a wave of unfamiliar reverence. There was a calm hush in the foyer, where shoes were neatly arrayed on wooden racks. He glanced toward the main prayer hall, glimpsing its plush carpet and simple arches. Modest banners welcomed visitors in multiple languages, "Peace be upon you, welcome to our community," and "Standing together for justice." The smell of Arabic coffee wafted in from a side room, mingled with a faint trace of incense. Volunteers bustled about, setting up a modest sound system and placing name tags on a folding table. Amid the bustle, Zane appeared, looking both relieved and frazzled. He wore a neatly pressed shirt and slacks rather than his usual more casual attire, a reflection of his attempt to make the event welcoming to all. A sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, and his eyes looked slightly bloodshot from lack of sleep. "You two are a sight for sore eyes," he murmured. "We've got a good turnout so far. A few pastors, a rabbi, some folks from a Buddhist center, and a youth counselor from the local church. Plus some city council members said they might drop by. It's a lot to juggle." Adam placed a reassuring hand on Zane's shoulder. "You're doing something important. Let us know where we can help." Mark, trying to lighten the mood, gestured to the stack of folded chairs piled by a wall. "I'm good at manual labor, if nothing else." A faint grin crossed Zane's face. Over the next hour, the mosque's community hall filled with an eclectic mix of attendees, women in hijabs, older men in kufis, young activists with protest pins on their backpacks, clergy members in collars or robes, and secular community organizers wearing bright t-shirts with slogans like, "No one is illegal." Amid this kaleidoscope, a hum of cautious curiosity circulated. Some of the mosque's regular congregants hovered at the periphery, uncertain about mingling with non-Muslim guests. Others jumped in eagerly, offering greetings and refreshments. A tall, elegant banner displayed Surah 18, and you might think them awake, while they were asleep, and we turned them to the right and to the left. It was a subtle reminder that God's wonders often lie hidden beneath appearances. When the program finally began, Zayn took the makeshift stage, a simple podium near the front of the room. A microphone squealed, then settled. His gaze swept across the room, momentarily resting on Mark and Adam in the back, before he spoke. Peace and welcome to all of you. We gather tonight recognizing the hardships many in our city face, especially refugees and asylum seekers. Our hope is to foster dialogue and to form partnerships that transcend religious or cultural lines. The Quran, our holy book, teaches us about empathy, justice, and the tests of life. Surah 18, in particular, reminds us that we may not always see the hidden wisdom behind events, but we are still called to act with compassion and fairness. He paused, looking slightly nervous, then continued, we have with us community leaders from different faiths and backgrounds. Each will share a few words on how their traditions address the call to protect the vulnerable. Then we'll have an open discussion about how we can collaborate more effectively. A soft ripple of applause followed as the first speaker approached the podium, a middle-aged pastor with salt and pepper hair who spoke of biblical verses calling believers to love the stranger in their midst. Next came a young rabbi who quoted from the Talmud about welcoming the foreigner and not oppressing them. Then a representative from a local temple recounted how Buddhist principles emphasize compassion and relief of suffering, regardless of origin or creed. As Mark listened, he found himself moved by the overlapping themes. Each tradition, in its own language, urged the same moral imperative: care for those in need, uphold justice, and remember that faith is hollow without action. Glancing at Adam, he saw the same awe reflected in his friend's eyes. The parallels echoed a verse from the Quran that Adam had once shared with him, speaking of how righteous deeds and faith go hand in hand. Yet not everyone in the room was entirely receptive. In the back corner, a few men from the mosque watched with folded arms and skeptical expressions. One of them occasionally shook his head in disapproval. Mark noticed Zayn glance over at them from time to time, and the tension was palpable. But the program continued undeterred, culminating in an open mic segment where attendees could voice concerns and propose ideas. Adam took the mic at one point, speaking with a calm sincerity. I work at a nonprofit that assists refugees. I've seen families torn apart by conflict and fear. Many times, what they need, beyond legal help or food or shelter, is just a human connection, a friend who cares. In Surah 18, the story of Moses and his teacher shows us that God's wisdom may be hidden, but our task is to remain patient, to keep learning, and to treat each other with compassion. We may not always understand why certain crises happen, but how we respond to them defines who we are. A small wave of applause followed his words. Mark, standing near the back, felt a lump rise in his throat. It struck him that Adam was no longer the uncertain convert he'd once been. He had grown into his faith as naturally as a tree sinking roots deeper into the soil. The applause subsided, and the mic passed on to others who offered practical suggestions, forming a citywide network for emergency housing, organizing language translation workshops, and lobbying local officials to revise harsh policies. As the event wound down, Mark stepped outside for a moment, feeling the need for fresh air. A cool night breeze caressed his face. The sky was studded with stars, but the glow of street lamps diluted their brilliance. He leaned against a low wall, replaying the evening speeches in his mind, particularly Zayn's reference to Surah 18 and the hidden layers of wisdom. Thoughts of his own journey flickered through him. He recalled the sense of wonder and apprehension he'd felt in the desert, how each new day seemed to chip away at his hesitation to fully embrace faith. And yet, doubt still lingered, like a stubborn shadow. He noticed movement from the corner of his eye. One of the men who had seemed skeptical inside the forum was exiting the mosque, heading toward the parking lot. He paused, glancing at Mark, then gave a curt nod before continuing on his way. Mark felt a pang of unease, Was this man offended by the multi-faith gathering, or by Mark's presence as an outsider? He reminded himself that no community was monolithic, that growth always came with friction. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Zayn emerging. The look on his friend's face was a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. "Hey," Mark greeted softly. "Great job in there." People really responded to the message. Zayn attempted a smile. "I hope so. A few from our congregation are not thrilled. They think we should keep our distance from non-Muslims and focus solely on the Muslim community." "That's short-sighted," Mark murmured. "If the Quran calls for justice, how can one limit that to only certain groups?" Zayn nodded wearily. "I've tried to explain that. But old mindsets die hard. Fear, insularity, it can be like a fortress." Mark placed a hand on Zayn's shoulder. "Fortresses can be breached." Today was a start. They re-entered the mosque, where the last few attendees were helping stack chairs and tidy up. Adam was in conversation with a young imam, both smiling in a way that suggested they'd found common ground. The hum of activity soon dwindled, leaving only a handful of volunteers who insisted on taking care of final details themselves. Zayn, Adam, and Mark made their way out to the parking lot together. The night air had turned chilly, and the streetlights cast elongated shadows on the asphalt. They paused by Adam's car, exhaling with the relief that comes after a major undertaking. For a moment, none of them spoke. Cars passed on the street, headlights sweeping across the dark facades of nearby buildings. Zayn finally broke the silence with a quiet, "Thank you both. I couldn't have done this without you." Adam shook his head. "You were the force that made it happen. We just pitched in." Mark added, "A lot of good ideas came out tonight. People want to help each other, across faith lines. That's the best of what religion can be." Zayn gave a small, grateful nod, then hesitated, taking in Mark's thoughtful expression. "What about you, Mark? How are you feeling these days?" He tried to keep his tone casual, but his concern was evident. Mark hesitated, searching for words. "I'm in a strange place," he finally said. "Closer than I've ever been to believing there's a divine plan. But still questioning. Surah 18 keeps echoing in my mind, especially Moses' confusion at his teacher's actions. I guess I feel like Moses, baffled by events I don't fully understand. But maybe that's how we learn." Adam smiled softly. "No one's forcing a timeline on you. Your journey is between you and God." They shared a quiet moment under the star-scattered sky, as though each recognized the gravity of Mark's statement. With subdued goodbyes, they parted, aware that the day's success was a prelude to more challenges ahead. The deeper one delves into matters of faith and social responsibility, the more one's resolve is tested. The city still simmered with tensions over immigration, many families remained in limbo, and the friction within Zayn's mosque was likely to intensify. Yet as Mark drove home, he felt a new sense of purpose, an intangible beacon urging him onward, whispering that each test might bear hidden blessings. Over the next week, life settled into a jagged rhythm. The three friends juggled their duties at the non-profit while Zayn addressed murmurs of dissent in his congregation. Some members grumbled that the event had been too public, too open, risking the purity of their Islamic identity. Zayn struggled to explain that working alongside others for justice did not dilute faith, if anything, it affirmed it. He quoted verses from the Quran extolling cooperation in righteousness. But old suspicions die slowly, and more than once, he left the mosque feeling drained and alone. Adam found a different kind of challenge. His father's health had taken a sudden downturn, prompting more frantic calls from his brother. Torn between duty at the non-profit and filial love, Adam found himself traveling back and forth on weekends. Each hospital visit chipped away at his emotional reserves, yet in each moment by his father's bedside, he sensed a quiet redemption. Though his father remained wary of Islam, there was a tenderness in their interactions, an understated acceptance. One evening, his father asked about the parables Adam liked so much. Adam tried to explain Surah 18, carefully avoiding jargon, framing it as a story about trust and humility in the face of life's mysteries. His father listened with closed eyes, occasionally nodding. While he made no grand declarations of belief, the conversation left them both with the subtle comfort of shared humanity. And then there was Mark, wrestling with his own spiritual stirrings. He found himself rereading Surah 18 in both English and transliteration, stumbling over Arabic words yet captivated by their rhythms. Sometimes, late at night, he'd open a window, let the cool air flood his apartment, and softly read aloud a line or two. He kept returning to a specific verse, and they found a servant from among our servants to whom we had given mercy from us and had taught him from us a certain knowledge. The idea that divine knowledge could be bestowed on an individual, someone who might seem ordinary, both awed and unsettled him. In stolen moments of reflection, Mark wondered if that servant could be any sincere seeker. Perhaps each of them, in times of crisis, received some small measure of that knowledge if their hearts were open. One Saturday, feeling the weight of solitude, Mark phoned Adam to ask if he could join him for the dawn prayer at the mosque. Adam was silent for a moment, maybe from surprise, then graciously agreed. The next morning, the sky was ink-black when they arrived, a faint band of purple gracing the horizon. Inside the prayer hall, the atmosphere was serene, the overhead lights muted. A small congregation of regulars had gathered, men quietly standing in rows, women behind the partition. The imam's soft recitation of the Quran filled the stillness with a measured, melodious cadence. Mark stood at the back, observing. He tried to mimic the basic motions, bowing, prostrating, though he was self-conscious about his inexperience. When the prayer ended, no one seemed to stare or question him. A few worshippers offered polite nods or subdued smiles. Mark felt something stir in his chest, not quite euphoria, but a subdued sense of belonging. It wasn't the elaborate theology or the foreign language that affected him, it was the simple unity of bodies and souls turning toward a single point of reverence. Afterward, Adam guided him out to the courtyard, where a handful of people gathered to sip tea in the cool morning air. Someone offered Mark a cup, and he accepted gratefully, warming his hands on its surface. The taste was slightly bitter, scented with cardamom, but he found it oddly soothing. Adam introduced him as a friend from the non-profit, and no one pressed further. The conversation drifted to everyday matters, family updates, small talk about the weather, the best places to get fresh produce. Mark listened, feeling an odd mixture of relief and curiosity, as though he were an undercover traveler glimpsing a hidden oasis. The next day, a Monday, brought unwelcome news. A local ordinance had passed that potentially restricted the shelter options for asylum seekers, citing zoning regulations and concerns about overcrowding. The move was widely regarded as a backhanded method to limit sanctuary arrangements. At the non-profit, staff and volunteers were abuzz with alarm, uncertain how to proceed. Zayn's phone rang non-stop as community leaders sought the mosque's support to protest the decision. Adam grimly coordinated with legal teams, scanning for loopholes or ways to challenge the ordinance. Mark, for his part, dove back into the logistical chaos, calling every contact he had to see if alternative spaces might be available. By midweek, frustration reached a fever pitch. The newly arrived families were at a standstill, some forced to move yet again, driving them further into despair. A sense of collective fatigue settled over the team. One evening, long after sunset, the three friends stayed behind in the empty non-profit office, the overhead fluorescents humming in the quiet. Papers were strewn across desks, and the faint smell of stale coffee hung in the air. Mark stared at a whiteboard crammed with lists of families needing immediate placement, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "This can't go on," he muttered. "We're playing musical chairs with these people's lives. Every time we find a safe spot, some policy or technicality uproots them again." Zayn rubbed his temples. "I know. We've appealed to local officials, but everything moves at a snail's pace. Meanwhile, families suffer." Adam, leaning against a desk, massaged the back of his neck. His eyes were drawn to a handwritten poster pinned to the wall, displaying a verse from the Quran in English, and whoever saves one life, it is as if he had saved all of humanity. He sighed. That's the scale of moral responsibility we're dealing with. But I'm not sure how to keep going when every door seems to slam shut. In the oppressive hush that followed, Mark found himself recalling a line from Surah 18, so they turned away from them, and took refuge in the cave, their Lord spread out for them of his mercy. The memory flashed like a small lantern in darkness. He spoke quietly, haltingly. Maybe, we need to create our own version of that cave. A space of refuge that no one can just shut down. Something the system can't so easily target. The others looked at him with curiosity, and he tried to clarify. Look, the city keeps citing zoning laws, building codes, all sorts of bureaucratic nonsense. What if we collaborated with private homeowners who have extra rooms, like a host family network? Something less official that flies under the radar. It might not solve everything, but it could help some. Adam's eyes brightened. A host network. That's not a bad idea. We'd have to be careful, though, to make sure it's safe for both families and hosts. Zayn considered it. I can float the idea at the mosque. We have plenty of families with spare rooms or finished basements. Some are well off enough that they might welcome the chance to earn blessings by sheltering refugees. Churches, synagogues, other groups might do the same. Though the plan was rough, it offered a spark of hope. They brainstormed until midnight, sketching an outline for a pilot project. It felt like constructing a ramshackle raft, uncertain if it would hold steady in turbulent waters, yet it was better than letting people drown. By the time they finally parted ways, each carried a subdued yet determined optimism. That week, Zayn pitched the idea at the mosque. The response was mixed. Some were enthusiastic, citing the rewards of hospitality in Islam. Others worried about potential legal repercussions or the complexities of mixing families of different cultural backgrounds. Still, enough interest emerged that a small coalition began to form, with a half-dozen congregants offering to open their homes temporarily. As word spread, a few local churches and non-profits signaled support. Mark and Adam worked on preliminary screening processes, ensuring that placements would be safe for both parties. Within days, the first refugee family, an older couple from Eritrea, moved into a spare room offered by a friendly widow named Mona, who lived alone in a modest suburban house near the mosque. Mona was a soft-spoken woman with a kind smile, delighted to have company in her once-empty home. The Eritrean couple, anxious and overwhelmed, found solace in Mona's gentle hospitality. Though they shared no common language other than a handful of English words, they bonded over home-cooked meals and quietly respectful gestures of welcome. The story spread, and more volunteers stepped forward. Little by little, a patchwork of caves began to materialize, each a private haven shielded, at least temporarily, from the city's harsh regulations. One evening, Mark visited Mona's house along with Zayn, bringing a small hamper of groceries and toiletries. When they arrived, they found the Eritrean couple in the living room, sharing tea with their host. A local translator was also there, bridging the language gap. The atmosphere glowed with warmth. The couple's relief was palpable, and Mona seemed equally grateful for their companionship. As Mark stood in that cozy living room, a wave of emotion threatened to overwhelm him. He thought back to his dream of wading through a flood, clutching a child's hand. Perhaps this was the emergent safe ground, a place where adversity could not easily intrude. Zayn, moved by the scene, murmured, "This is faith in action. It's what the verse about saving a life truly means." Mark nodded, wordlessly recalling the synergy among all traditions that had been voiced at the Interfaith Forum. In that moment, the boundaries between backgrounds, languages, and beliefs seemed to melt into a quiet unity of purpose. Outside, the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. The night ushered in a hush of promise, as if the city, despite its conflicts, might cradle moments of genuine compassion. Mark felt an inner stirring again, that nudge reminding him that the door to belief was not locked, merely waiting for him to push it open. A few days later, Mark confided in Adam and Zane that he wanted to learn how to pray more properly. His voice quavered as he admitted his desire. "I'm not sure what it means for me, but I keep feeling drawn to the rituals, the discipline, the connectedness. I'd like to know the basics, at least." Adam's face lit with quiet joy, and Zane offered an encouraging smile. They began showing him the steps after work, guiding him on the words and movements. Though Mark stumbled over the Arabic phrases, he found an unexpected calm in the motions. Each bow and prostration seemed to whisper of humility and the possibility of grace. He still grappled with doubts about the unseen, but every inch of surrender felt like a rung on a ladder he'd been afraid to climb. Meanwhile, the host network gained momentum. A few families were placed, forging cross-cultural friendships that surpassed the staff's initial hopes. Mona's success story was replicated in other homes. Of course, the network remained fragile, reliant on goodwill and the absence of official clampdowns. Yet for the moment, it provided a lifeline. And each new life saved from immediate peril felt like a minor miracle. Inevitably, not everyone was pleased. Rumors surfaced that certain city officials were monitoring these private arrangements, looking for violations of occupancy codes or unlicensed lodging. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste. One Wednesday night, Zane came face to face with a mosque member who accused him of inviting trouble by allowing non-Muslims to exploit Muslim hospitality. The accusation stung, reflecting a deep misunderstanding of Zane's intentions. Yet as Surah 18 illustrated again and again, deeper wisdom often lay beyond immediate appearances. Zane forced himself to respond calmly, citing the Islamic tradition of welcoming travelers and those in distress. The confrontation ended with uneasy silence, no resolution. Zane walked away, heart pounding, reminding himself that steadfastness in righteousness rarely comes without opposition. That same week, Adam received a call that his father's condition had deteriorated once more, prompting yet another trip out of town. This time, the outcome seemed dire. Doctors talked in hushed tones about palliative care. Adam's brother hovered in the hospital corridor, eyes rimmed with tears, no longer standoffish about Adam's faith. In the quiet hours of waiting, Adam found himself sitting by his father's bed, reciting surahs softly. Whether his father understood, Adam couldn't be sure. But the older man seemed to find solace in Adam's presence, gripping his son's hand with surprising strength. Late one evening, when Adam believed his father was asleep, he whispered a prayer, invoking God's mercy and forgiveness for the man who had given him life but never quite grasped his spiritual path. To his surprise, his father's eyelids fluttered, and a low whisper emerged, "Thank you." Adam's heart surged with a poignant mixture of sorrow and gratitude. In that moment, he felt the intangible presence of Surah 18's lessons once again, the ways in which God might guide hearts, or at least open them, when all hope seemed lost. Back in the city, Mark and Zane carried on, awaiting news. On a Thursday afternoon, Mark stepped away from the nonprofit's bustling front office to take a phone call from Adam. The corridor was dim, sunlight filtering through dusty blinds. Adam's voice was subdued. "He's not doing well," Adam said. "Doctors think it might be any day now." Mark closed his eyes, a wave of empathy washing over him. "I'm sorry, man. I really am. Is there anything we can do?" "Just pray," Adam said softly. "Pray for mercy, for ease. And please give Zane my salams." When Mark hung up, he stood still for a long moment, the phone clutched in his hand. Then, in a quiet alcove near the stairwell, he did something he never would have imagined months ago. He raised his palms, recalling the posture Adam and Zane had shown him. He didn't speak loudly, just mouthed words, heartfelt yet clumsy. "God, help Adam's father. Help Adam. Please bring them peace. You know what's best, even if we can't see it. Please." His voice trailed off into the hush, and a tear slipped down his cheek. In that silent corridor, Mark felt simultaneously vulnerable and strangely embraced by an unseen presence. Events continued to accelerate. the city's political landscape grew more polarized. Protesters clashed on social media, some praising the grassroots host network, others decrying it as a flagrant sidestep of regulations. Meanwhile, more families arrived, fleeing conflicts abroad with little more than the clothes on their backs. At the mosque, Zayn coordinated ongoing efforts for interfaith collaboration, though friction persisted. One Friday's sermon explicitly extolled the virtue of helping refugees in need, citing the Prophet's example with the people of Medina. Many nodded in agreement, but a few turned away in dissent. Still, the synergy among the friends, Mark, Zayn, and Adam, remained a steady flame in the midst of chaos. Each recognized that their differences, once a source of potential discord, had woven them into a multifaceted tapestry of strength. Zayn's unwavering devotion, Adam's convert zeal tempered by compassion, and Mark's earnest searching had forged an alliance that transcended typical boundaries. They often recalled Surah 18's repeated theme, what you see on the surface isn't the entire story. Beneath the swirl of daily struggles lay the unseen hands of destiny, the gentle pull of a wisdom beyond their grasp. On a gloomy Saturday evening, with rain drizzling across the city, Mark and Zayn sat in a diner waiting for Adam's updates on his father. Their eyes darted toward Mark's phone, which lay face up on the table as if an urgent message might arrive at any moment. The waitress poured coffee into their cups, the steam rising in ghostly wisps. Neither man had much appetite for the burgers they'd ordered. At last, a text came through. Mark's eyes flicked to the screen. "He's gone," Mark read aloud, voice uneven. Zayn inhaled sharply, nodding as though he'd expected it yet still felt the blow. They exchanged a look of shared grief. Within moments, Mark's phone buzzed again, a brief follow-up. "I'm okay. Heading back soon. Appreciate your prayers." Zayn whispered, "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un," the Quranic phrase meaning, "We belong to God, and to Him we shall return." Mark dipped his head, feeling the truth in those words, even if he couldn't pronounce them properly. A wave of empathy washed over him for Adam's loss, for the fragile finality of this life they all clung to. He wondered if Adam's father had found some measure of peace, if those late-night prayers by his hospital bed had opened a final door. They sat in silence, the diner's neon lights casting a garish glow on the wet sidewalk outside. Zayn finally cleared his throat. "Let's head over to Adam's place when he returns. We should be there for him." Mark agreed, determined to stand by his friend in this raw moment. Deep down, he felt the stirrings of a conviction he could no longer ignore. Life was so fragile, so heartbreakingly transient. Whatever illusions he'd held about total self-sufficiency or indefinite procrastination of faith commitments felt increasingly hollow. He recalled a line from Surah 18 about the people of old who slept in a cave for centuries, only to awaken and find that the entire world had changed around them. Time was beyond human control, any day might be their last. He sipped his coffee, finding it bitter. Rain tapped the glass window behind him, tracing rivulets in the glow of the street lamp outside. A quiet resolve took shape in his heart, spurred on by Adam's sorrow and Zayn's steadfastness. He remembered that cosmic ledger from Surah 18:49, and the book of deeds will be placed open, and you will see the criminals fearful of that within it. While the verse could inspire fear, Mark sensed it also carried a promise: no act of kindness, no moment of humility, would be lost. Everything mattered. That night, as the rain continued and the city hunkered down in darkness, Mark found himself silently whispering the words he'd once heard from Adam, "O God, guide me and keep me firm." He spoke them not as a bystander but as someone prepared, however hesitantly, to commit. Outside, the diner's neon sign flickered, and passing headlights splashed quick bursts of light across the wet pavement. It felt as though the entire world, in that moment, was holding its breath, suspended at the threshold of change. The rain-drenched city seemed to mourn in tandem with Adam's grief over his father's passing. Drops clung to window panes, rolled off rooftops, and gathered in overflowing gutters, as though the sky itself wept. Mark and Zayn, torn between concern and helplessness, awaited Adam's return, unsure how to console him for a loss so profound. At the nonprofit, they handled day-to-day operations with subdued determination, aware that families still needed their help, no matter how heavy their own hearts felt. It was dusk when Adam finally texted them that he was back in town and heading to his apartment. Mark and Zane dropped everything to be there. Driving through the slick streets, headlights reflecting in glowing puddles, they exchanged few words. A subdued tension lay between them. Mark kept recalling the words he'd uttered just hours before, "Oh God, guide me and keep me firm." He wondered if such a prayer, uttered in the hush of a diner, could have any real weight. When they arrived at Adam's place, they found the apartment dimly lit, lamps turned low, as if to match the somber mood. Adam opened the door with reddened eyes and a drawn face, but he mustered a faint smile of welcome. Zayn stepped in first, quietly offering words of condolence in Arabic, "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un." May God grant him mercy. Mark followed, managing a simple, heartfelt hug that Adam returned with trembling shoulders. They settled in the living room, a gentle hush enveloping them. The ambient hum of traffic seeped through half-drawn curtains. On the coffee table lay a small arrangement of dates and a pitcher of water, Adam's attempt at a hospitable gesture, even in his sorrow. For a time, no one spoke. The friends simply sat in solidarity. Zayn cleared his throat softly, then asked about the funeral arrangements. Adam explained that his father, not being Muslim, would be laid to rest according to the customs of Adam's family's church. The funeral was scheduled for the following week, and Adam planned to attend, though it felt strange to him, standing as the only Muslim among them, reciting his own prayers in quiet solitude. His gaze flicked to the worn Quran on a side table, as if drawing strength from its presence. Mark leaned forward, hands clasped. "We'll do whatever you need," he said gently. "If you want us there, we'll come. If you need space, that's fine too." Adam's eyes shimmered with gratitude. "Thank you. Both of you." He paused, swallowing hard. "Despite everything, I feel, there was a closure. He asked me to pray for him. It wasn't a conversion or anything like that, just a moment of openness. I'll treasure that, at least. But it's still hard." They lapsed into another pensive silence, the overhead lamp casting soft, elongated shadows on the walls. Zayn eventually spoke, his voice subdued. "There's a verse in Surah 18 that always resonates with me in times like this, when life and death weigh heavily. The story of the young men in the cave who slept for so long, only to awaken and find their world changed. It reminds me that life is fragile and that everything we know can shift in the blink of an eye. Yet God's care for them was constant. Maybe that's a reminder for us now." Adam nodded, appreciative. Mark, who had become increasingly drawn to such reflections, added quietly, "I keep returning to the idea that God's perspective is so much vaster than ours. I don't say that lightly. I've resisted it for years, but, these last weeks, I've felt a pull I can't deny." Despite his grief, Adam caught the note of vulnerability in Mark's voice. He recognized the tension that had hovered over Mark, somewhere between skepticism and a budding willingness to embrace faith. For a moment, Adam's sorrow lifted, replaced by a gentle wonder. Perhaps, even in mourning, there could be seeds of hope. They spent the rest of the evening in hushed conversation. Zayn offered practical help. He could contact local imams if Adam needed religious counsel, or even help coordinate support from the community. Mark, looking pained, worried about the financial and emotional toll of traveling back and forth if more family matters arose. Adam admitted it was a strain, but said he'd manage. Eventually, midnight approached, and the two visitors took their leave. Outside, the rain had subsided to a fine drizzle, the damp air tinged with the smell of wet pavement. Adam stood in the doorway, thanked them again, and the door clicked shut with a finality that felt both sad and strangely reassuring. The following days brought a slow, somber routine. Adam continued at the nonprofit, though Zayn and Mark insisted he reduce his workload. Families still poured in, battered by life's storms, searching for hope. Mark began formally coordinating the fledgling host family network, calling it the Haven Initiative. He designed a simple leaflet, distributing it at churches, mosques, and community centers. A modest website followed, featuring testimonies from hosts like Mona and the Eritrean couple. The site encouraged more families to volunteer their spare rooms, extolling the scriptural basis for hospitality in Islam, Christianity, and beyond. Slowly, the network grew. It was hardly a complete solution, but it offered a glimmer of refuge to those who needed it most. Meanwhile, Zayn grappled with lingering disputes in his mosque. A small but vocal group of congregants considered his interfaith activities too liberal, accusing him of diluting Islamic principles by partnering with outsiders. Zayn tried to stay calm, reminding them of the Prophet's own alliances with various tribes and people of different faiths. He cited the famous Pact of Medina, an early example of Muslims living cooperatively with Jewish tribes. Some were swayed by his arguments, others remained skeptical. The tension weighed on him, but he clung to the conviction that bridging divides was an Islamic mandate. In quieter moments, he recalled Surah 18, "You might think them awake, while they were asleep," a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. Perhaps, in time, hearts would shift. Mark, too, went through subtle transformations. He began quietly joining Zayn for certain prayers at the mosque, standing in the back row, uncertain whether to pronounce the Arabic words or simply listen. Each prostration, forehead to the ground, shook him with an inexplicable sense of release, as if letting go of an immense burden. He confided in Adam one afternoon, over coffee in the break room. "It's strange," he said, stirring sugar into his cup. "I've always seen myself as a restless seeker, dabbling here and there, never sticking to one path. But now, I'm drawn to something deeper, even though I'm terrified of commitment." Adam sipped his own coffee thoughtfully. "I get it. Faith is a form of surrender, and surrender goes against every modern instinct. We're taught to value autonomy above everything. But true freedom, in my experience, came when I realized I couldn't navigate life's storms on my own strength." Mark's gaze flicked to the hallway, where anxious families still waited for assistance. "You mean, relying on God's mercy, rather than your own willpower?" Adam nodded. "Exactly. Doesn't mean we stop acting or doing our best. We just recognize there's a limit to our control. That's when we trust the one who controls all outcomes." Though Mark didn't respond immediately, those words sank into him like rain seeping into parched earth. He realized that acknowledging God didn't diminish his individuality, it framed it in a larger, more meaningful context. After all, everything in life, jobs, relationships, even the city's social upheavals, seemed ephemeral. Perhaps dedicating himself to a higher cause was the truest path to significance. The thought both frightened and elated him. Meanwhile, Adam juggled his father's funeral plans with the demands at the office. On the eve of his departure to attend the service, he received a call from his brother. "Just letting you know," his brother said in a subdued tone, "we've got a pastor coming to do the eulogy. I wanted to see if you're comfortable with that." There was a brittle moment of silence. Adam exhaled. "Of course I am," he said gently. He was Dad's pastor. "I'm not expecting an Islamic funeral. He deserves the send-off that matches his life." Another pause, then his brother murmured a soft thanks. It was a small moment of accord. Adam hung up with a heavy heart but also a subtle sense of peace. Perhaps love, in its many forms, could bridge even the most daunting gaps. He traveled the following morning, leaving Mark and Zayn to hold the fort at the nonprofit. The plane ride felt surreal, drifting among clouds while he stared at the seat back in front of him, mind churning with memories. He thought of Surah 18's repeated line, "My Lord knows best their number," referencing the youths in the cave whose precise details only God understood. The verse reminded Adam that not everything could be neatly explained or quantified. His father's life, and their fractured relationship, had been messy and incomplete. But God saw it all and would judge with perfect justice. Clutching his battered pocket Quran, Adam recited a prayer for mercy, tears sliding down his cheeks as the aircraft hummed. Back in the city, Mark found the office strangely empty without Adam's calm presence. A new wave of displaced families arrived that afternoon, Syrians, Congolese, and a few from Yemen. Their eyes held desperation and fatigue, many carrying children who clung to their legs. The staff at the nonprofit scrambled to manage the surge, and Mark was thrust into a leadership role he never anticipated. He found himself directing volunteers, verifying documents, and reassuring tearful mothers. He paused once by the hallway mirror, startled by his own reflection, sweaty, disheveled, yet determined. In a moment of near panic, he whispered a prayer under his breath, no longer feeling awkward about it. He pleaded for patience, for guidance, for the ability to meet so many needs with dignity. By evening, the crowd thinned. Zayn arrived from the mosque, having spent hours coordinating a food drive. He looked as tired as Mark felt. They exchanged weary nods and retreated to an empty conference room where they collapsed into chairs. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Outside, the late sunlight cast slanted rays through the windows, painting the scuffed floor in gold. Zayn exhaled deeply. We need more volunteers. It's beyond what we can handle with our current staff. Even the host network is at capacity. People are stepping up, but there's just not enough space. Mark closed his eyes momentarily. I know. Every time we fill one need, 10 more appear. It's overwhelming. A contemplative silence fell between them. Then Zayn, voice heavy with concern, said, we need a more systemic fix. Something bigger than patchwork solutions. But the city council is bogged down in political battles. Meanwhile, these families suffer. I wish I could replicate the miracle from Surah 18, where God preserves people in a hidden refuge. Mark gave a rueful grin. If only we had a cave they could all hide in for a century or two until the city's laws changed. The fleeting joke dissolved into a grim hush. Both men recognized the seriousness of the situation. Night crept in, and they eventually locked up the office, stepping out onto a street awash in fading twilight. The sky glowed with deep blues and purples. City lights flickered on in the distance. Zayn asked if Mark wanted to join him for Isha prayer at the mosque. Mark hesitated, feeling a little self-conscious, but then nodded. Yes, he whispered. I'd like that. The mosque was quieter than usual at that hour. A few latecomers lingered, a smattering of worshippers forming neat rows. Mark stood again near the back, following the motions. This time, however, he recited softly, under his breath, the words he'd been practicing, Allahu Akbar, Subhana Rabbil Azim, Subhana Rabbil A'la. His pronunciation wavered, but the meaning gripped his heart, acknowledging God's greatness, bowing in humility. In the rhythm of standing, bowing, prostrating, Mark felt a hush settle over his spirit, as though each motion peeled away a layer of doubt. When the prayer ended, Mark knelt briefly, pressing his forehead to the carpet in silent supplication. He didn't notice Zayn's gentle gaze. Rising, he wiped an unexpected tear from his cheek. Outside, as they slipped on their shoes at the mosque entrance, Zayn rested a hand on Mark's shoulder. I saw you reciting, he said softly. How did it feel? Mark swallowed, unsure how to express what swirled inside him. It felt like coming home to a place I've never been, he managed. A faint, tremulous smile passed between them, and in that moment, Mark recognized that he was nearly ready to embrace Islam in full. Yet he sensed that the final step required a leap of trust he'd never taken before. He wanted to do it wholeheartedly, without reservations or half-measures. The next day brought news that Adam had safely arrived at the funeral site. He texted Mark and Zayn brief updates, describing a small, intimate service at the family church. He noted how he stood to the side while the pastor spoke warm words about his father's life, his dedication, his stubbornness, his flawed humanity. Adam mentioned placing a single white rose on the casket, silently reciting Al-Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Quran, as a farewell. I felt at peace, Adam wrote, even if I was the only Muslim there. By evening, Mark and Zayn learned that Adam would remain in his hometown for a few more days, helping sort out legal paperwork and supporting his grieving mother. The non-profit pressed on without him. Mark juggled multiple roles, coordinating families, managing volunteers, and dealing with the city's continuing pushback on informal hosting arrangements. Zayn immersed himself further in bridging the mosque's internal divides. Some days, he felt like he was in an endless debate, quoting passages of the Quran to justify compassion for non-Muslims, or explaining that Islam's universal message didn't conflict with community solidarity. The tension within the mosque didn't abate, but he saw glimmers of understanding here and there. One afternoon, Mark received a call from Mona, the widow who had hosted the Eritrean couple. "We have a problem," she said, her voice trembling with apprehension. "Some official came around, said they're looking into whether I'm violating occupancy regulations. I'm worried they'll force me to remove my guests." Mark's stomach sank. "Okay, stay calm," he urged. "Did they leave any paperwork or official notice?" "Yes, something about an inspection next week. I don't want to uproot them, they have nowhere else to go. But I also don't want to break the law." Mark reassured her that they'd consult with the nonprofit's legal team, though in truth, there were few easy answers. After hanging up, he slumped in his chair, rubbing his eyes. Day by day, the city's resistance to the host network hardened. While no one had explicitly shut them down yet, it was clear the authorities viewed the arrangement with suspicion. Mark found himself rereading Surah 18 that evening, focusing on the section where Moses repeatedly questions his teacher's actions, only to discover each act had a hidden protective purpose. Could the adversity we face now be preserving us from a worse fate, he wondered. The thought offered only partial comfort. Under mounting pressure, Mark and Zayn scrambled to fortify the host network's legal standing. They wrote petitions, rallied the interfaith coalition, and urged local officials to adopt compassionate policies. A new wave of protests sprang up, with some supporters holding signs reading "Open Homes, Open Hearts" outside City Hall. Others accused the initiative of harboring illegal activity. The media latched onto the controversy, airing heated debates on local news channels. In the midst of this storm, Adam's absence was felt acutely, though Mark and Zayn tried to step up, channeling their friend's calm resilience. Finally, Adam returned, haggard from grief and travel but resolute to rejoin the battle. Arriving at the nonprofit with a small suitcase in tow, he received a chorus of relieved greetings from staff. He embraced Mark and Zayn in turn, eyes brimming with emotion. They led him to an empty office, where the three sat for a private debrief. Adam listened intently, jaw tightening at the latest developments, threatened inspections, city scrutiny, hostile questions from some at the mosque. "We'll handle it," he said firmly. His voice had a newfound gravitas, as if the parting from his father had endowed him with a clearer sense of purpose. "We've come too far to be deterred now." That evening, they gathered at Adam's apartment for a modest dinner. Adam insisted on cooking a simple meal, lentil soup and fresh bread, despite his evident fatigue. Over steaming bowls, they fell into deep conversation about the emotional toll of their work, the friction in the community, and the bigger questions of faith. At one point, Adam took a long breath and looked pointedly at Mark. "I sense something shifted for you," he said gently. "Last time we talked, you said you were feeling a pull." Mark lowered his gaze, gripping his spoon as though it anchored him. "Yeah," he admitted. "It's gotten stronger. I've been praying, with Zayn at the mosque, and sometimes on my own. I'm not sure if I'm doing everything correctly, but the sincerity is there." His voice quavered. I think I'm ready to accept Islam." A charged silence descended. Zayn's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and Adam exhaled, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. Mark continued, words tumbling out, "I know that means bearing witness, saying the Shahada, right? But I don't want it to be performative. I want to mean it with all my heart." Zayn reached across the table to grip Mark's hand. "Then do it." When your heart is ready, the rest follows. Tears threatened to overwhelm Mark. He swallowed hard, then nodded. Tomorrow, he whispered. I'd like to do it tomorrow at the mosque, if that's okay. In front of the imam and some witnesses. It feels right to stand publicly for something I've danced around for so long. Adam rose, circled the table, and embraced Mark. Allahu Akbar, he murmured, tears of joy brimming in his own eyes. This is a blessing. We'll be there for you, every step of the way. The rest of the meal passed in a haze of affection and trepidation. Mark felt a new lightness, as though he'd finally stopped wrestling with the invisible rope that had been tugging at his heart. Yet a small part of him remained anxious, aware that a public declaration could shift how others perceived him. Would some see him as an opportunist? A traitor to secular ideals? But the quiet conviction in his core felt more pressing than any external judgment. The next day arrived with a bright sky, the sun shining as if to bless the occasion. Mark dressed more formally than usual, khakis and a neat button-down shirt. He found himself checking his reflection in the mirror, noticing his own nervous eyes. A wave of doubt struck him. Was he prepared to assume all the obligations that came with faith? Then he recalled the many nights of silent prayer, the sense of belonging he felt in prostration. In that memory, he found reassurance. Adam and Zayn picked him up, offering warm, steadying smiles. They drove to the mosque, where a few people had already gathered to welcome Mark's commitment. The imam, a soft-spoken scholar with a gentle demeanor, greeted them in the foyer. A sense of hush enveloped the small group as they moved into the prayer hall, overshadowed by intricate calligraphy and subdued light filtering through stained glass windows. The imam explained that the process was straightforward. Mark would declare in Arabic and English that there is no God but God and that Muhammad is his messenger. It wasn't a complex ritual, but a profound statement that would reshape Mark's spiritual identity. Standing before the imam, flanked by Adam and Zayn, Mark's hands trembled slightly. He repeated the Arabic words slowly, guided by the imam's patient syllables, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Then in English, he proclaimed, I bear witness that there is no God but God, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God. As the final word left his lips, a potent stillness settled, broken only by the sound of Adam quietly weeping, tears of joy coursing down his cheeks. Zayn and a handful of other witnesses murmured praises to God, offering Mark embraces and words of welcome into the fold of Islam. The imam placed a comforting hand on Mark's shoulder. From this moment, you're as a newborn in faith. Your past misdeeds are forgiven. May God guide you, protect you, and make you steadfast. Mark closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of those words. He pictured the cosmic ledger from Surah 1849, where every deed is recorded. Yet in that moment, he felt as though the pages had been wiped clean, or at least infused with mercy. They lingered in a small circle afterward, exchanging prayers and well wishes. Some of the mosque members brought small plates of sweets, urging Mark to partake as a token of celebration. Despite the tension that had plagued the community, there was genuine warmth for Mark's decision, a recognition that his sincerity transcended petty disputes. Zayn later told Mark that even a few critics had softened upon seeing the earnestness in his eyes. That afternoon, the three friends left the mosque together, the sun high and golden in a bright blue sky. Outside, traffic buzzed along the street, vendors sold fruit from sidewalk stalls, and children played in a nearby park. To Mark, everything looked sharper and more alive. Even the city's swirling problems, bureaucratic clampdowns, xenophobic attitudes, seemed less insurmountable in the light of divine possibility. For the first time, he understood how Adam had found solace in faith's anchoring power. They returned to the non-profit, where staff greeted Mark with curious smiles. Word had spread quickly. Some volunteers approached to congratulate him, others simply nodded respectfully. One older refugee from Syria, upon learning the news, embraced Mark, tears glistening as he recited verses in Arabic that Mark couldn't fully comprehend but found deeply moving. Amidst this quiet celebration, a phone call shattered the calm. another city inspector had shown up at one of the host homes, demanding immediate access to assess alleged overcrowding. Panicked voices spilled through the office as a volunteer relayed the crisis. Mona's situation had not been an isolated incident, other homes were now under scrutiny. The threat of forced evictions loomed for these refugee families. A cold fury gripped Adam as he listened. "Enough," he muttered, grabbing his jacket. "We have to push back harder. Let's meet with city officials directly. If they want to shut down private charity, they'll have to face us." Zane nodded, eyes smoldering with determination. Mark, newly invigorated in spirit, added, "And we need to rally our supporters. The press, the faith communities, everyone. Let's put their hypocrisy on full display." They quickly organized an impromptu strategy session, calling in allies from local churches, synagogues, and the broader interfaith coalition. Zane reached out to contacts at the mosque who sympathized with their cause, while Mark drafted an urgent press release. Adam coordinated with a legal advisor who offered to represent the hosts pro bono. Within hours, a press conference was scheduled for the next morning on the steps of City Hall. That evening, the three men hardly slept. Each was consumed by the frantic energy of planning. Mark found himself repeatedly whispering short prayers he barely knew how to pronounce, yet which felt like a lifeline to the Almighty. He recalled Surah 18's admonitions, that life's trials serve as tests of one's sincerity. He prayed for the clarity to navigate this test with courage, to defend the vulnerable without succumbing to anger or despair. At dawn, the press conference drew a small crowd of activists and reporters. Cameras flashed, and microphones were shoved forward as Adam took the podium. Rain threatened, dark clouds looming overhead, but the weather held off just enough to let him speak. Zane stood to one side, Mark to the other, flanked by a diverse group of supporters. Adam's voice rang out. "We are here today to expose a grievous injustice. Families fleeing horror in their homelands have found compassionate hosts, yet city officials want to penalize these hosts under the guise of overcrowding. If our government fails to provide adequate shelters, and private citizens step in to help, why would the city punish them? We ask the mayor and council to enact an emergency measure protecting these arrangements. We cannot turn a blind eye to human suffering." A cheer rose from parts of the crowd, mingling with the staccato shudder of cameras. Next, a pastor spoke about Christian duty to shelter the stranger, referencing biblical passages. A rabbi cited Talmudic teachings on the sanctity of life. A Buddhist leader mentioned compassion as the foundation of ethical living. Zane briefly took the mic, quoting from the Quran, "Whoever saves a life, it is as if they have saved all of humanity." He then urged the officials to interpret regulations through a lens of mercy rather than bureaucracy. The synergy of different faith voices lent weight to the cause, a united moral plea for decency. Mark had intended to remain behind the scenes, but upon seeing the emotional fervor, he felt compelled to add his voice. Stepping up to the microphones, he introduced himself as a staff member of the nonprofit and, with a tremor in his voice, admitted that he had only just embraced Islam the previous day. "I stand here not just as a new Muslim, but as someone who believes we're all responsible for each other," he said. "We can't let fear and red tape override compassion. These families need us, and we have the resources to help, if only the city would let us." A sudden hush fell over the crowd. Perhaps it was the raw sincerity in Mark's tone, or the knowledge that he was newly a part of the Muslim community and yet speaking in solidarity with all faiths. Applause broke out, punctuated by shouts of encouragement. A few reporters shouted questions about the specifics of Mark's religious conversion, but he deflected them gracefully, redirecting attention to the refugees' plight. In the background, Adam and Zane looked on with proud, teary smiles. The conference ended with a final plea for city leaders to meet with them. As the crowd dispersed, thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain began to fall in sheets, chasing people to their cars or under nearby awnings. Undeterred, the three friends huddled with the core group of faith leaders, discussing next steps. They planned a formal petition to the city council, a series of open letters, and possibly a legal injunction if the crackdown continued. Though the path ahead looked fraught with challenges, there was a unified resolve that refused to be quashed. In the days that followed, local media coverage ignited a citywide debate. Opinion pieces flooded the newspapers and online forums. Some praised the host network as an example of moral courage, while others lambasted it as reckless and illegal. The mayor's office released a guarded statement acknowledging the humanitarian concerns but insisting on adherence to housing codes. Social media lit up with hashtags both in support of and against the Haven Initiative. Through it all, the nonprofit staff worked tirelessly, Mark now wearing both the hat of a caseworker and that of an advocate for the newly arrived families. At the mosque, Zayn faced a fresh wave of both criticism and praise. Some congregants declared that the press conference was an unnecessary provocation, worried it would backfire and strain relationships with local authorities. Others, particularly younger members, lauded his courage. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, but Zayn stood firm, often pointing to Surah 18 as a reminder that the sincere pursuit of justice often encounters opposition. Moses questioned the actions he witnessed, but in the end he learned to trust a plan beyond his immediate understanding. He would say, "We may not know all the consequences of our stand, but we must do what's right." Adam, still grieving his father, found renewed purpose in championing the refugees' cause. He channeled his emotional turmoil into an impassioned commitment to serve, drawing on the Quranic ethos of caring for travelers, orphans, and the oppressed. His father's passing weighed heavily, but it also fueled a desire to leave a legacy of compassion, a testament that even in sorrow, one could strive for good. As for Mark, each day felt like an initiation into a faith he had only recently embraced. He learned to recite short surahs for his prayers, stumbling over the Arabic but persevering. In quiet moments, he found solace in small passages from the Quran, often returning to Surah 18's layers of meaning, parables that spoke of hidden wisdom, humility, and unwavering faith in the divine. He confided to Adam and Zayn that he felt like a seedling, fragile but determined to grow. Their support was unwavering, peppered with practical tips on ablution, suggestions for further reading, and gentle invitations to mosque events. When Mark faltered, wrestling with the magnitude of religious obligations, they reminded him that faith was a gradual journey, not a sprint. In this charged atmosphere, the city council finally agreed to hold a public hearing on the matter of private hosting for displaced persons. The hearing date was set for the following week, and it promised to be a turning point. Both sides, proponents of the Haven Initiative and those favoring stricter regulation, would have the chance to present arguments. It felt like the apex of all the tension that had been building, a formal confrontation between compassion and bureaucratic rigidity. On the morning of the hearing, the line outside City Hall formed early. Supporters of the host network carried signs quoting scripture, Bible verses, Quranic lines, Jewish teachings, alongside secular slogans about human rights. Opponents held placards warning of overcrowding hazards, potential legal liabilities, and the creeping influence of unregulated charity. Police officers kept a wary eye on the crowd, ensuring order. A mix of anxious, determined energy electrified the air. Mark, Adam, and Zayn stood together near the front of the line, exchanging solemn glances. The next hours would be critical, not just for them personally but for hundreds of vulnerable families depending on the outcome. Inside the council chamber, tension thickened. Reporters crammed into every corner, and city officials sat at a long curved table, wearing stern expressions. One by one, speakers approached the podium to deliver their testimonies, some emotional, others analytical. Zayn spoke first among the trio, citing Islamic teachings on justice and compassion, pointing out that Islam's emphasis on communal welfare aligned with the moral imperatives of other faiths. Adam followed, detailing specific stories of refugee families who had found safety in private homes, highlighting how such arrangements filled gaps that city shelters couldn't handle. Mark then delivered a heartfelt account of how hosting had literally saved lives, referencing a family on the brink of being sent back to a war zone. At times, the hearing grew heated. Opponents derided the Haven Initiative as naive and dangerously lax. A few city council members seemed sympathetic, others remained aloof. One councilman grilled Mark, questioning whether these families had been properly vetted. Mark responded with what protocols they did have, but admitted they were learning as they went, reliant on volunteer background checks and the watchful eyes of host families. The councilman scowled, unimpressed. The session stretched on for hours. Citizens from all walks of life stepped up to speak, some praising the moral backbone of the host network, others decrying it as an invitation to social chaos. Emotions ran high, tears were shed, and angry outbursts occasionally punctured the decorum. By the time the council adjourned to deliberate, exhaustion had set in. The entire chamber buzzed with anticipation, everyone wondering which way the verdict would go. In a gesture of mercy, the council announced they would issue a written decision the next day rather than drag the hearing into the late evening. Emerging from City Hall, the three friends were met by a swarm of reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward with rapid-fire questions. Adam offered a succinct statement: "We've presented our case in good faith. We trust the council will do what is right and just." Zayn added, "Our sacred scriptures command us to protect the vulnerable. This is an opportunity for our city to live up to those principles." Mark, though still reeling from the intense questioning, mustered a final plea: "Families are relying on this. Let's not abandon them." With that, they slipped through the crowd, hearts pounding with both dread and hope. That night, sleep proved elusive. Mark paced his small apartment, occasionally checking his phone as if expecting news in the middle of the night. A mild wind rattled the windows, stirring old flyers and newspapers on his coffee table. He tried to pray, but his mind raced with what-ifs. If the city ruled against them, dozens of host homes could be forced to evict refugee families. Panic threatened to overtake him. Then he remembered the story of the prophet, who faced far greater struggles yet remained patient. "God, help me trust in your wisdom," he whispered, pressing his palms together in the darkness. Morning came with a pale sunrise that did little to banish Mark's anxiety. At the non-profit, the atmosphere crackled with suspense. Everyone knew that the council's decision would be released sometime that afternoon. Families whispered among themselves, volunteers tapped their feet nervously, and staff kept glancing at their phones. Adam and Zayn arrived, sharing tense smiles with Mark. They tried to bury themselves in work, but every ring of the telephone made their hearts jump. Finally, just after lunch, an email pinged in Zayn's inbox, bearing the subject line: "City Council Decision on Hosting Arrangements." Hands trembling, Zayn opened it, quickly skimming the text before reading it aloud. The council, it stated, had voted by a narrow margin to enact a 6-month pilot program allowing carefully regulated private hosting, contingent on basic safety inspections and host registration with the nonprofit. It wasn't a complete victory, there were restrictions, bureaucratic hoops to jump through, but it wasn't an outright ban either. Host families could continue providing refuge without fear of immediate legal action. The city would monitor the program's efficacy during those 6 months and then revisit the policy. A wave of relief swept through the office. Applause broke out, mingled with whoops of excitement. Zayn and Adam exchanged embraces with staff. Mark sank into a chair, head in his hands, overwhelmed by gratitude. Tears blurred his vision as he realized that, at least for now, the families they'd been sheltering would remain safe. It was a precarious reprieve, but a reprieve nonetheless. The intangible sense of unity, forged in adversity, pulsed through the building like a living spirit. The three friends stepped outside, into the bright afternoon sun, to share the news with supporters who had gathered in the parking lot. Cameras flashed again, though this time capturing broad smiles instead of grim concern. Adam explained the pilot program's conditions, acknowledging that further effort was needed to refine procedures. Zayn thanked the city for recognizing the moral imperative behind the hosting initiative, urging them to stand firm against any backlash. Mark, still emotional, managed a simple yet powerful statement: "We believed compassion could triumph, and today we've seen that it can, at least for a time." As they stood side by side, wind ruffling their clothes, Mark felt a renewed sense of awe at how far they had come. He recalled Surah 18's account of Moses and his teacher, how each obstacle had concealed a hidden mercy. Perhaps the city's scrutiny had forced them to organize more effectively, to rally broader support, to push for a formal program that could save even more lives. He breathed a silent prayer of thanks, letting the swirl of gratitude fill him. If there was one lesson he had gleaned, it was that adversity and mercy often dance together in the grand narrative of existence. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the clouds in pink and orange, the three friends found themselves back at Adam's apartment, each exhausted but exhilarated. They spoke softly over cups of tea, letting the magnitude of the day sink in. Mark reflected on his formal entry into Islam, how it had coincided with this turning point in their collective struggle. He felt an almost surreal sense of purpose, as though God had orchestrated a series of events, personal loss, moral conflict, community tension, to bring them all to this juncture. Zayn summarized the swirling thoughts that lay unspoken in each of their minds. Surah 18 teaches us about patience, humility, and trust in divine wisdom. We've seen glimpses of that wisdom here. I don't claim to understand it fully, but I can't deny that something greater than ourselves is at work. Adam nodded, lifting his cup to his lips, silent agreement shining in his eyes. Mark, heart brimming, added his own reflection, I guess the real journey begins now. We have 6 months to prove that compassion works better than fear. Let's make every day count. They raised their teacups in a modest toast, a symbolic gesture of unity. Outside, the evening sky darkened, streetlights flickering to life. Within the apartment, a sense of tranquility settled, shaped by shared trials and renewed faith. The day's victory was neither absolute nor permanent, but it was enough to remind them that with perseverance, even the mightiest barriers could crack. In the hushed space, the echoes of Surah 18 lingered, whispering timeless lessons about illusions, hidden truths, and the day when every deed would be laid bare. For now, though, they could rest in the knowledge that, at least in this chapter, mercy had found a foothold, and they had been instruments of that mercy, bound together in a parable as enduring as the desert sands. For a time, it felt as if the city itself exhaled. The council's decision to implement a 6-month pilot program preserving the host arrangements brought a fragile peace to the streets. Reporters slowly dispersed from the nonprofit's doorstep, their cameras seeking fresh angles elsewhere. The anxious refugees, who had braced themselves for another sudden uprooting, settled into a cautious optimism, grateful for the modest reprieve. And in the hearts of Adam, Mark, and Zayn, a quiet gratitude mingled with a renewed awareness that the real test had only just begun. Word of Mark's conversion to Islam continued to spread in small ripples through the community. He received congratulatory messages from volunteers who barely knew him, as well as curious inquiries from old acquaintances who wondered what had spurred this shift. Occasionally, he faced skepticism. An old friend teased him about jumping on the faith bandwagon after seeing how passionately the Muslim community was defending refugees. But Mark recognized his own sincerity. This was no convenient masquerade. It was the culmination of long, restless searching, shaped by witnessing the tangible power of mercy in action. One late afternoon, he stood in the nonprofit's lobby, surveying the scene. Families from a variety of nations sat in plastic chairs, waiting for appointments. A translator guided a newly arrived couple through essential forms, pointing to each line with patient thoroughness. 2 children played quietly in a corner, building a makeshift fort out of empty cardboard boxes. Beyond them, volunteers scurried about, delivering water bottles and warm smiles. Mark felt a familiar tug in his chest, recalling the many nights he had wrestled with doubt, only to find, in the final analysis, that faith gave him both clarity and direction. He noticed Zayn striding toward him, a quiet determination in his posture. "Busy day," Zayn said, half smiling. A hush of exhaustion edged his voice. He'd spent the morning mediating another dispute at the mosque, where certain congregants complained about perceived overreach into politics. "Are we set for the workshop tonight?" Mark nodded. They had organized a training session for new host families who had stepped forward following the city council's decision. A half-dozen families from various faiths would attend, each eager to learn the basics of supporting refugees, from cross-cultural communication to navigating legal complexities. "Everything's in place," Mark said. "I'm making copies of the host guidelines now. If all goes well, we might have enough rooms to accommodate the families on our current waitlist." Zayn exhaled with relief. "That's encouraging. Let's just pray the city won't clamp down with more rules. God willing, we'll show them that this pilot program can work." A few minutes later, they regrouped in the break room to finalize details. Adam was there, leaning against a counter with a mug of tea in hand. He'd just finished a phone call with a donor who was willing to fund a small emergency relief fund for host families who faced unexpected expenses. Though the conversation had gone well, Adam's brow remained furrowed, an echo of lingering sorrow for his father. Mark sometimes saw that shadow pass over Adam's features, like a distant cloud briefly darkening the sun. Yet Adam carried on, buoyed by the same faith that had led him to see hope even in times of personal grief. They spent the remainder of the day tying up loose ends, helping families locate childcare options, coordinating with a local grocery store that offered discounted produce for refugees, and checking on the new host home placements. When evening arrived, Mark and Zayn made their way to the small conference room for the workshop, while Adam stayed behind to field urgent calls from families who couldn't reach the office during normal hours. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed, the air conditioning rattled, and a faint smell of fresh coffee clung to the air. Despite the mundane surroundings, the workshop turned unexpectedly moving. Men and women from different walks of life, some older couples with empty nests, some younger individuals with spare rooms, sat in folding chairs around the perimeter. A Catholic priest who'd collaborated with the nonprofit gave a short talk on compassion, citing biblical verses. A rabbi followed suit, referencing the Jewish imperative to remember one's own experience of exile. Zayn then highlighted the Quranic perspective, quoting a portion of Surah 18 that spoke of God's subtle ways of providing shelter, referencing the sleepers of the cave. Mark chimed in with practical tips, explaining how something as simple as labeling food in multiple languages could ease daily life for newly arrived families. Each attendee listened with rapt attention, as though they sensed that these small acts of solidarity were forging a moral tapestry far larger than any single faith tradition. By the end of the evening, several prospective hosts lingered to ask questions, scribbling notes on notepads. The synergy in the room felt electric. A tall, soft-spoken woman approached Zayn, explaining she had grown up Mormon but had fallen away from church life. "I don't really know what I believe," she admitted, "but I do know that these families need our help. I've got space in my house, so, why not share it?" Zayn nodded, warmth shining in his eyes. "Your sincerity is all that matters," he said. "Faith, or no faith, if your heart calls you to help, that's an act of compassion worthy of respect." Standing nearby, Mark felt his own chest tighten with empathy. He recalled his years of spiritual wandering, the sense that he was always a visitor in other people's belief systems. Now, as a newly declared Muslim, he realized that empathy cut across all lines, weaving people together through acts of kindness. At times, Surah 18's repeated lesson about illusions and ephemeral wealth echoed in his mind. The illusions of difference might be the biggest mirage of all. Underneath, people longed for the same dignity and sense of belonging. Over the following weeks, the city settled into a precarious but tangible rhythm. The host program continued under the watchful eye of inspectors. Some officials remained skeptical, but the initial success stories, like that of Mona and the Eritrean couple, gained local media attention. Donations trickled in. A modest but growing number of volunteers offered their time as translators, counselors, or mentors. At the mosque, tension with the more conservative congregants eased somewhat, though occasional friction remained. Zayn still endured accusations of watering down the faith, but the tide of public opinion favored his stance. Many saw his efforts as a natural extension of Islamic compassion. Amid these shifting dynamics, Adam, Mark, and Zayn fell into a routine of daily prayer, ongoing advocacy, and fellowship. They prayed far together whenever possible, sometimes at the mosque, sometimes at Adam's apartment when the pace of work left them too drained to commute before dawn. Mark grew more confident in his recitations, though he still stumbled over Arabic words. Adam reassured him that sincerity carried more weight than perfect pronunciation. The Quran was revealed as guidance, not as a barrier, he would say. Surah 18's verses lingered in their hearts, a constant reminder that divine wisdom could unfold in ways they never predicted. Yet trials remained. As the pilot program advanced, the city council requested periodic updates. At one monthly review meeting, an emboldened councilman grilled Adam on the safety protocols for each host home. Though the nonprofit had done its best to verify living conditions, occasional oversights occurred, prompting the councilman to scowl and hint that the program might be revoked if further issues arose. The tension in the chamber was thick, each side digging in. Outside City Hall, a small protest formed, with a handful of signs reading, "Send them back," and "Charity begins at home, not for foreigners." Mark, passing by, felt a pang of disgust. He recalled Surah 18's warnings about arrogance and ingratitude, how wealth or privilege could foster illusions of superiority. Each sign reminded him that prejudice was as old as human civilization. In private, Adam admitted his fear that the city's bureaucracy might eventually strangle their initiative. "We got 6 months," he said, pacing Zane's living room one evening. "But we've used up almost 2. The council is pressing for more conditions. If they keep moving the goalposts, we might lose the chance to institutionalize this program." Zane, eyes clouded with worry, nodded. "We need more robust data, success stories, documented proofs that hosting works. If we can show it's safer, cheaper, and more humane than city shelters, maybe they'll make it permanent." Despite his outward confidence, his shoulders sagged under the weight of responsibility. Mark sat on the edge of a chair, tapping a pen against his notepad. "What about the Interfaith Coalition? We can gather testimonies, maybe create a short video featuring host families and the refugees themselves, describing how the arrangement changed their lives. Sometimes public sentiment matters more than raw data. If enough people see the human side, the council might not dare shut us down." This idea gained traction rapidly. Within days, a small team of volunteers, some with filmmaking experience, began capturing interviews. Mona spoke tearfully about how the Eritrean couple had become like extended family. An elderly host from the local synagogue described hosting a family from Syria, recounting how he'd learned to cook Middle Eastern dishes in their honor. A young father who'd fled civil war in his homeland shared how his host's kindness restored his faith in humanity. Each narrative wove a tapestry of shared resilience. During this time, Mark's own spiritual growth advanced in quiet but significant ways. He memorized Al-Fatiha fully, then added short surahs from the Quran. Adam and Zane coached him, patiently explaining the meaning behind each line. Mark noticed how references to gratitude, to the fleeting nature of worldly life, and to the moral imperative of aiding others appeared again and again in the text. He began to find echoes of Surah 18's themes everywhere, illusions of self-sufficiency, hidden blessings in adversity, the interplay between knowledge and humility. Even so, old habits died hard. Some nights, he lay awake, burdened by the near-impossible scope of suffering in the world. Could local activism really matter in the grand scheme? One especially rough evening, he drove aimlessly through deserted streets until he reached the edge of the desert, stepping out under a spray of stars. The memory of his earlier vigils in that vast emptiness resurged. He whispered a prayer, voice carried off by the cool wind. "I can't fix everything. But if this path is right, give me the strength to keep walking it." A kind of stillness enfolded him in that moment, as though the night sky itself murmured affirmation. He returned to the city with steadier resolve, reminded that Moses, in Surah 18, pursued knowledge despite repeated stumbles and confusions. Life was not about flawless progress, it was about sincerity in the quest. Months passed in this pattern of determined advocacy, quiet spiritual reflection, and small but meaningful triumphs. The short documentary highlighting the host network's success circulated online, drawing positive attention to the nonprofit. Even a few previously skeptical council members commented on the heartfelt accounts. Donations increased, enough to expand the staff by a few part-time roles. With each new arrival, the office hummed with an almost electric sense of possibility, tempered by the knowledge that everything hinged on the pilot program's ultimate outcome. Zayn's Mosque hosted another interfaith gathering, this time inviting local officials to witness how the congregation welcomed their Christian, Jewish, and secular neighbors with open arms. Though some worshippers still resisted the idea, the majority had come to appreciate the alliances forged in adversity. Zayn, standing at the podium, read a passage from Surah 18 about how God grants power or knowledge to those he wills, urging humility rather than arrogance. He then turned to each visiting group, acknowledging the deep moral ties that bound them. In the back of the hall, Mark caught sight of a few older men who'd once criticized Zayn's approach. Now, they nodded solemnly, as though time and experience had softened their view. Adam, meanwhile, found partial closure regarding his father's death. Sorting through his father's old belongings, he discovered handwritten notes and diaries that revealed a man wrestling with many of the same existential questions Adam had faced. The knowledge stirred a bittersweet ache. He shared some passages with Mark and Zayn, marveling at how universal the longing for meaning could be. In the end, Adam reflected, we're all seeking to be understood and to find purpose. Surah 18 reminds us that even the sleepers in the cave, cut off from the world, were part of a greater design. At last, the 6-month mark of the pilot program arrived. The city council scheduled a final vote to determine whether the arrangement would become a permanent part of municipal policy. Anxiety engulfed the nonprofit once again, but this time tempered by the many success stories they had gathered. In the run-up to the meeting, local news outlets showcased interviews with host families and refugees who credited the program with saving lives. Even the most skeptical officials had to acknowledge the pilot's relative success, few safety incidents, widespread community support, and a sense that these refugees were integrating more smoothly than if they'd been shuttled from one overcrowded shelter to another. On the day of the vote, the council chamber overflowed with reporters, activists, religious leaders, and local citizens. Mark, Adam, and Zayn stood together, a palpable camaraderie radiating from them. Representatives from churches, synagogues, temples, and the mosque filled the rows behind them. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, a reflection of the city's newfound unity and tension in equal measure. A hush descended as the council members filed in. The mayor, flanked by advisors, began with procedural formalities, then announced that the motion on private hosting would be put to a vote. Each council member spoke in turn, explaining their stance. Some praised the moral clarity of the program, others raised lingering concerns about long-term feasibility. The final tally seemed uncertain, until the mayor tallied the votes. By a narrow but decisive margin, the council approved permanent guidelines. Host families could continue providing sanctuary under a well-defined structure, ensuring safety without suffocating bureaucracy. A ripple of relief and joy coursed through the chamber. Applause erupted, mingled with shouts of gratitude. Cameras flashed, capturing tears of victory on many faces. Adam embraced Mark and Zayn in a tight three-way hug, his shoulders shaking with emotion. Mark felt a thrill in his chest, recalling how improbable it once seemed that the city would legitimize such an arrangement. Zayn bent his head briefly, silently mouthing a prayer of thanks. The trifecta of relief, faith, and communal triumph filled the air like a bracing wind after a storm. Once the session ended, a flood of supporters poured out onto the steps of City Hall. The bright afternoon sun illuminated the crowd, which now felt more like a celebration than a protest. Local faith leaders joined hands, symbolizing the unity that had carried them through. Refugee families who had come to witness the vote hugged their hosts. One small child clung to her mother, eyes wide with a happiness that only the possibility of a stable future can bring. Adam caught sight of Mona, the widow who'd taken in the Eritrean couple, weeping tears of joy as she thanked a council member who stopped to listen to her story. Mark found himself at the center of a small media scrum, microphones thrust at him once more. But this time, he spoke with renewed poise and conviction. This vote isn't just a policy decision, it's a testament to what we can achieve when we prioritize human dignity over fear. I stand here as someone who once questioned whether faith could truly inspire tangible change. Now I see it every day. Different beliefs came together, guided by shared principles of compassion, and look at what happened. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras whirred. Mark felt a wave of humility, recalling his earliest days at the nonprofit, when he was unsure if he believed in anything beyond a vague spirituality. The memory struck him like a parable from Surah 18, illusions giving way to deeper realities. He realized that his old hesitation was akin to that ephemeral wealth or power the Quran warned would vanish, leaving only the substance of one's actions and the sincerity of one's heart. By the time the crowd began dispersing, the sun was dipping toward the western skyline, painting the cityscape in gold. Adam, Zayn, and Mark retreated to a quiet green space behind City Hall, a small, manicured garden with benches and a trickling fountain. Birds fluttered among leafy branches, their twilight calls echoing in the hush. The three sat together on a stone bench, shoulders touching, each lost in his own swirl of emotion. Zayn spoke first, voice trembling with gratitude. "We did it. Or rather, God allowed us to do it. I keep thinking of Surah 18, and you might think them awake, while they were asleep. It's like the city was asleep, and maybe we helped it wake up to compassion." Adam nodded, his gaze drifting to the fountain's gentle ripples. The illusions were strong, fear of outsiders, red tape. But like the parables in the Quran, adversity can hide blessings. We ended up forging alliances that never would have existed otherwise. Mark let out a quiet laugh, emotion stirring behind his eyes. I used to think faith was intangible, all about private feelings and rituals. I never imagined how powerfully it could move communities. Without Surah 18's reminders, about hidden wisdom, about illusions, about the day when every deed is exposed, I don't know if I would have had the strength to keep going. A mild breeze rustled the leaves overhead. The fountain gurgled softly, as though affirming their reflections. Adam lifted his face to the sky, where streaks of orange and pink signaled the approach of dusk. He murmured a prayer of thanks, brief but profound. Zayn and Mark closed their eyes, each silently adding his own supplication, forging a spiritual bond that transcended words. Night fell gently, and they lingered in the garden until the last traces of daylight vanished. In the city beyond, people carried on with their lives, driving home from work, picking up groceries, meeting friends for dinner, mostly unaware of the monumental shift that had just occurred. But Adam, Mark, and Zayn sensed that a new phase had begun, one in which compassion was not just a lofty ideal but a living reality embraced by law. The path ahead was not free of challenge, problems would arise, host arrangements might still fail, and bigotry could flare again. Yet they had crossed a threshold, proving that faith, when harnessed to serve the vulnerable, could reshape the world in small but mighty ways. Their footsteps eventually led them out of the garden, away from City Hall's imposing facade. Streetlights clicked on, illuminating sidewalks once overshadowed by the day's press of bodies. Now, foot traffic waned, leaving the three friends walking side by side in a companionable hush. Mark exhaled, remembering the cyclical nature of Surah 18, how each story within it looped back to the overarching message of humility and the ephemeral nature of worldly illusions. He felt as though he were living that cyclical truth. Every challenge gave way to hidden mercy, which in turn prepared them for the next trial. They arrived at their parked cars, exchanging tired but triumphant smiles. Before parting ways, Adam caught each of them in a brief embrace. "We should pray Isha together," he suggested quietly, glancing at his watch. "Maybe at the mosque, or at my place. Let's close this day with gratitude." Zayn agreed, and Mark nodded, his chest tight with feeling. In that simple proposal lay the essence of how far they had come, three individuals once linked only by circumstance, now bound by the threads of faith, service, and mutual respect. They had walked through illusions, faced bureaucratic storms, and risked the scorn of others, only to find that the path of shared compassion was the surest route to real unity. Much like the travelers in Surah 18, they discovered that true knowledge revealed itself step by step, often after mistakes and misunderstandings. Yet each stumbling block had been an invitation to trust in the wisdom of a plan greater than their own. They climbed into their cars, engines humming to life. The road stretched out before them, shimmering under streetlights, pregnant with possibilities. Mark took the wheel, inhaling deeply as he imagined the next chapter, the permanent host program, the continuing arrival of new families, the mosaic of faith communities finding synergy rather than conflict. His phone buzzed with a text from a volunteer, thanking him for the day's victory. Smiling, he set the device aside, focusing on the gentle glow of the asphalt beneath his headlights. In the rearview mirror, he caught sight of Zane's car behind him, Adam's just beyond, 3 sets of headlights rolling through the night. The image touched something deep in Mark's heart. Once, he had felt alone, adrift in a swirl of spiritual questions. Now, he understood that the illusions he had feared, of unworthiness, of cosmic indifference, could not stand against the clarion call of genuine faith. The city had not changed so much as awakened, and in that awakening, Mark saw a reflection of his own journey. They were all travelers, forging ahead on a road lit by hope and humility. At a stoplight, Mark rolled down his window, letting the cool night air wash over him. Far above, stars glinted like scattered pearls. He recalled how Surah 18 ended with a reminder that even the greatest prophets were servants of a Lord whose knowledge envelopes every speck of creation. The words resonated in him like a gentle bell, humility in the face of the divine, service in the face of human need. When the light turned green, he guided the car forward, heart brimming with a simple, unshakable certainty. Tomorrow would bring new trials, but they would meet each one together, anchored by faith, led by compassion, and reminded always that beyond the illusions of this world lies a final accounting where every earnest deed shines with everlasting significance.